Prologue 10 years earlier. I watched from behind the couch as they took my mother's body away. Even I knew that wasn't my mother anymore, just a deteriorating shell of who she was before her last breath. Everyone spoke in hushed voices, not wanting to catch my attention or startle me, the child. I'd been told my mother was very ill, suffering from a rare disease that was becoming increasingly infamous in the werewolf community. I didn't understand it. I didn't understand all of the big words and explanations about her illness, and I certainly didn't understand her death. Why would the moon goddess take my mother away from me? I felt hot tears forming in my eyes as my mother's body vanished from sight. She was really gone. I would never see her again. She would never braid my hair, read her novels to me, or comfort me during storms, ever again. It was just me and Daddy now. At least I still had him. Once all the people had left, I crept out of the shadows and went searching for my father. He was a stern man, but he loved Mother and me. We were both hurting now, but we had each other. I rounded the corner to his office, following the dim light of his desk lamp, and found him seated in his chair with a glass of brown liquid pressed to his lips. I could see, even from the hallway, that his eyes were bloodshot and his hair was disheveled. I quietly entered the room, not wanting to startle or upset him further. When I was finally within arm's reach, I gently rested my hand on his shoulder, wanting to comfort him and feel some kind of comfort in return. My mother had always been the one who provided comfort in the family. His head jerked sharply in my direction, his eyes dark and full of anger. A low growl gradually erupted from the back of his throat, and in one swift movement, he reached out and struck me across the face with the back of his hand. "Don't touch me," the father yelled, allowing his glass to drop to the floor and shatter. I stood there, both frozen and dumbstruck. My father's demeanor and actions caught me off guard and caused me to lose myself further to the negative thoughts and emotions that had been consuming my mind. I'd seen Daddy angry before, but never like this. He was furious with me. He looked at me as if I were the cause of his pain and suffering. Had I somehow been the cause of Mother's death? Of all the pain I was enduring, that thought hurt worst of all. Little did I know, the pain was only beginning. Chapter 1 Present Day. Staring at myself in the cracked bathroom mirror, I took in my appearance, just as I did every morning before tending to the pack house. I'm not particularly sure why I did such a thing every day. Nothing changed. Now and then, I may have a new cut or bruise to cover, but besides that, my dark brown hair, light olive skin, and brown eyes remained unchanged. It's not like it mattered how I looked anyway. No one noticed me. A few of the Omegas I worked with would chat with me now and then, but for the most part, even they avoided me. After all, they were Omegas. Although I worked with them, I was still ranked higher than they were. They weren't supposed to speak to anyone ranked above them unless spoken to first. I sighed as I exited the bathroom and made my way towards the front door. For a moment, I contemplated rummaging through the cabinets for a bite to eat, but I didn't want to wake Father. He was especially unruly in the mornings. Not only that, but I knew I wouldn't find anything. There was never food in our pack house apartment, and if there was, it was for Father. Accepting my empty stomach once again, I slid out the front door, very gently shutting it behind me. It was too early in the day for Father to already have a reason for being angry at me when I got home. My first stop every morning was the basement supply closet. The Omegas and I met there every morning to receive our daily tasks. Most days were the same. We lived rather monotonous lives, but now and then there'd be a slight change in our duties. Those were the exciting days. I quickly made my way down the damp stairs into the basement, where I found that I had arrived just in time. Alice, the woman in charge of us, began to hand out the assignment sheets. "I heard we have something special on our list today." Laurel whispered excitedly to me as I silently joined the group. She was one of the few Omegas who wasn't afraid to talk to me. I nodded to her, not wanting to draw attention to myself, and waited for Alice to hand me my paper. "All right, Omegas," Alice started, but then paused. And Audrey, she added. Today is a very special day. It's Archibald Whitaker's birthday, and Alpha Dean has decided to celebrate his father with a formal ball for the pack tonight. You all will tend to your normal daily duties in a timely manner today, and then you will begin setting up for the ball. Tonight, you will be serving food and drinks. I expect each of you to look your very best. Black dresses will be provided for the females, and a white button-up and black pants will be provided for the males. This is the first ball or party that the Dark Root Pack has seen in decades, so it's very important that everything goes smoothly. The pack is extremely excited for the event, and Alpha Dean expects perfection. Now get busy. Alice clapped her hands together several times in quick succession, indicating that we needed to hurry up and get moving. The top of my list was familiar, helping to prepare breakfast for the pack and cleaning the library. Usually, several more tedious tasks would follow, but today, in their place was only set up for the ball. It appeared that we then had an hour to get dressed and cleaned up before we had to arrive for serving. Breakfast was prepared and served in record time, and the library was never too big a task, seeing as I was assigned to it every day. During the setup time, Alice appeared again to give us our specific stations for the evening. I couldn't help but be excited, even though I wasn't able to enjoy the ball like a regular pack member. I'd likely be given odd looks all night, as people would know I wasn't an Omega, but wonder why I was doing an Omega job. As I helped Laurel spread a cloth over one of the drink tables, Alice approached us. She quickly handed Laurel a piece of paper with her assigned job for the night before handing one to me. Audrey, I've given you a very important position here tonight. Seeing as you're not an Omega, I thought it'd only be fitting for you to be the one serving the Alpha tonight. You'll be his and his father's personal attendant, and you'll serve the Beta and his family as well. My jaw dropped at her words. I had to serve Alpha Dean and his entire table. I'd never been anywhere near our Alpha, and I was okay with that. Everyone in the pack knew of his reputation. It was one dark enough for us to all keep our distance. What? I stuttered, sounding rather childish. That's correct, Miss Allen, so make sure you're cleaned up well tonight. You have the most important job of the evening. Just like that, my anxiety skyrocketed. I could feel my body instinctively wanting to tremble, but I fought against it the best I could. I typically enjoyed any time I had to work because it meant I didn't have to be around my father, but given a choice between Alpha Dean and my father, I wasn't sure which option was better. I swallowed hard and nodded to Alice, as I was currently unable to speak. I had gotten used to the fear of going home to my father every day, but having the same fear outside of our private home was foreign. Other males and strangers always made me nervous. The uncertainty of any situation did, but seeing as I was typically only around the Omegas, I was fine. After Alice finished with what she needed to tell me, she moved on to the next person and excused me to get ready. I quickly helped Laurel with the finishing touches on the drink table before exiting the dining hall and making my way upstairs to the family apartments, where my father and I lived. I hoped that if I made it back early enough to get ready, my father would still be at work. I quietly entered our apartment and scurried back to my bedroom with the black dress I'd been provided. Although it was just solid black, it was rather fashionable. Even though we were just the help, it was a formal ball. They couldn't have us looking anything less than professional. I showered, taking only about 5 minutes, before getting dressed and working on drying my hair. My hair was rather thick and took some time to dry, even with a proper hair dryer. Once I checked off that time-consuming task, I decided to tackle my makeup. I always kept it simple, usually only using makeup to cover up cuts and bruises. Tonight, though, I applied my foundation correctly and even added a thin line of eyeliner with some mascara to top everything off. My hair hung in its natural waves, as I didn't have much time to spare, but I felt it looked presentable. Just as I sat on the edge of my bed to slip on the only pair of black flats that I owned, I heard the front door shut. Father was home early. I froze as I listened to his loud footsteps echo down the hallway, slowly nearing my room. I knew he'd be angry that I was home so early. He'd be furious that I was wearing a dress. He'd ask questions and assume answers. I only hoped that his anger wouldn't escalate to violence. I didn't have the time to cover up a bruise before the ball. "What are you doing?" he yelled as he stood in the doorway, staring down at me with bloodshot eyes. "Hi, Daddy," I said softly, hoping to neutralize his anger, if at all possible. "We have to serve at the ball tonight. They provided us with clothing to wear." "You look inappropriate," he grumbled. My anxiety was already high, causing me to tremble lightly, but his words made my face fall. "I thought the dress looked nice." I never got to dress nicely or wear makeup, so I thought I might look pretty for once. I should have known better. I wasn't pretty. I never have been, and I never will be. Father was right. I probably looked inappropriate in such an outfit. Perhaps they did this to humiliate us. I felt my cheeks heating up at the very thought. "I'm sorry, Father. I didn't have a choice in what to wear," I whispered, struggling to hold back tears. Father stepped forward and roughly grabbed me by the shoulders, causing me to hiss in pain as his fingers dug into the bone. "How many times do I have to tell you to speak up?" He shook me before finally releasing his grip and throwing me back on the bed. I lay back and whimpered, cowering behind a pillow. He was right, though. He did always tell me to speak louder and more clearly, but at the same time, he'd get angry if I spoke too loudly. He'd accuse me of raising my voice. "You're pathetic," he yelled before turning around and storming out of the room. "I'll deal with you later. I have a ball to attend." I dabbed at my eyes, hoping threatened tears hadn't messed up my hard work. Feeling satisfied that my makeup was still okay, I hopped off my bed and ran down the hallway, desperate to get out of the apartment before my father found something else to get angry about. More than likely, he'd be furious that I was running, but if I left quickly enough, he wouldn't be able to express that anger to me. He never acted the same way in public. In front of everyone else, he was a respectable father and a hard worker. My father often provided security for the pack and was relatively well known. When he demanded that I only be given the work of the Omegas, the pack assumed I had done something disrespectful or worthy of such a fate. Before he chose my life for me, I aspired to work as a pack nurse or teacher. I made my way to the pack house dining hall in record time. I knew my father wouldn't follow. That would put him at risk for exposing who he truly was to fellow pack members. He would remain only a monster in my eyes. When I arrived, only Laurel and several other Omegas were present. Laurel was stationed at the food table, as she'd be serving food for myself and the other few Omegas who were chosen to serve specific tables. I slowly made my way to the front of the room. The large table was empty, but I knew eventually it would seat our Alpha, his father, and the Beta family. I carefully set the table with plates and cutlery, ensuring that everything was in its proper place. I'd never encountered the Alpha family before, therefore I didn't know how picky they'd be. After I felt the table was made correctly, I joined the Omegas at the far side of the room. Most of them had been assigned to specific tables, while those who hadn't were assigned tasks such as serving food, drinks, or decorations. There would be dancing at the ball, so decoration was a must. About 10 minutes later, the dining hall began to fill. I knew the Alpha's table would be the last, so I waited patiently in position, trying to contain my trembling as each group entered the room. Once every table was complete, I grew even more nervous. I knew at any moment the Alpha and his father would be entering the room. I stood at the edge of their table as the doors opened. Slowly, it revealed Alpha Dean and his father, Archibald. That was all there was to the Alpha family, as the rest were either deceased or located elsewhere. Due to that, the Beta family followed and were allowed to sit with the Alphas. Alpha Dean seemed to stare me down as he entered the room and approached his seat. This was the first time I'd ever been so close to him, and I noticed his eyes were two different colors, one blue, one hazel. They were spectacular, really, especially against his tan skin. At this time, my wolf became present. She was yipping and jumping around in my mind, begging to be acknowledged, but I forced her to the back of my head. This was not the time or place for my wolf instincts. Ignoring her attempts for control, I approached the Alpha's table, prepared to take their requests. "Alpha Dean, it's a pleasure to serve you tonight," I spoke quietly, but I made sure I was loud enough for them to hear me. "What would your table like for their first course this evening?" Alpha Dean stared at me for quite some time. He was making me nervous. His two different colored eyes held mine captive, as he seemed not to care at all for the menu in front of him. Perhaps my mind was full of fantasies, but it appeared that he was only focused on me. "Steak cooked rare," Alpha Dean replied, his voice low and gruff. His voice alone made me want to shiver, but I refrained. It held so much power and authority. It was no wonder every member of our pack was entirely submissive to him. I couldn't help but wonder for a moment if this was how all alphas were, but I ultimately decided that must be the case. Why would one alpha differ from the rest? I scribbled down Alpha Dean's request and returned to the kitchen, determined to provide the best service possible for my alpha, after handing the order into the Omegas who were assigned to cook. I returned to the table with glasses of ice water. As I set the cups on the table, I could feel Alpha Dean's eyes on me again, but this time I didn't look up. My wolf was still fighting for my attention, but I continued to ignore her. I was too distracted by both my job and Alpha Dean's odd behavior. If it weren't for his intoxicating, woody smell, I probably would have been creeped out. Instead, I was curious. Why did he seem so fascinated with me? As I placed a bundle of silverware down in front of Alpha Dean, he spoke again. "You're not an Omega." I froze. Of course, it was obvious that I wasn't an Omega, but I hadn't been expecting Alpha Dean to comment on it. "That's correct, Alpha," I replied timidly. "Why are you working with the Omegas?" he asked. His tone never changed, and his face remained hard. I swallowed hard before speaking again. I couldn't understand why our Alpha was so interested in someone as insignificant as me. Should that worry me? My hands began to tremble despite my efforts to keep my anxiety under control. I took a deep breath, attempting to calm myself, but instead, I was overwhelmed with Alpha Dean's scent. "My father requested that I work with the Omegas, Alpha," I finally responded, unable to hide the shakiness in my voice. At first, I thought I was hearing things, but after a moment of staring into Alpha Dean's eyes, I realized he was growling at my response. In one swift movement, he grabbed me by my wrist, causing me to flinch away. It was an automatic reflex for me. For only a second, he appeared hurt and confused by my flinching, and only for a second did I even think about it. After only a couple of seconds more, sparks erupted on my skin where his hand held my wrist. They shot up my arm and filled my entire body with a comforting warmth. I gasped and tried to yank my arm away, but he held it tightly. Slowly, Alpha Dean leaned in close. The tip of his nose was barely touching my neck, my hair lightly caressing his face. He inhaled deeply, sending a shiver down my spine. "Consider today your last day on the job, little mate." Chapter 2. One moment, Alpha Dean was holding my wrist, whispering in my ear and calling me mate, and the next, I was being ushered out of the room by 2 guards. Everything was a blur. It all seemed surreal. I didn't understand. I finally acknowledged my wolf's persistent begging in my head, as she was always the only one I could turn to in times of distress. The men who escorted me out of the dining hall were gentle but silent and offered no answers. "The Alpha is our mate." "We found our mate," my wolf yipped over and over in my head. She seemed to be celebrating as she pranced back and forth, swaying her fluffy tail in the air. "I don't understand," I confided to her as the guards continued to lead me through the maze of hallways that made up our pack house. "Alpha Dean is our mate. We're the Luna of Dark Root. He's going to reject us. He'll treat us just like father," I told her, refusing to allow her optimism to give me false hope. She growled at me in response. Our mate would never do those things. I sighed and turned her out again, pushing her to the back of my mind. It made me sad to do so, as she was all I had, but dealing with her pain and disappointment when Alpha Dean rejects us or hurts us will be bad enough. I can't possibly deal with both of our disappointments. Before summoning his guards, I faintly remembered Alpha Dean telling me that he was sending me somewhere safe for the rest of the ball. I didn't know what that meant. I didn't understand any of this. How did I end up with an Alpha as a mate? Alpha Dean of all people, especially. Was he sending me out of the dining hall because he was ashamed of me? That must have been it. But why would he say tonight was my last night of work? Perhaps he was going to send me away, or maybe even kill me. An Alpha couldn't have his pack knowing that a lowly she-wolf such as myself was his mate and his pack's rightful Luna. I may not have been an Omega, but there was no way I deserved such an honor. I was pulled from my thoughts when the guards stopped in front of a large mahogany door with the words Alpha's Wing engraved in the wood. Alpha Dean had sent me to his quarters? Now I had even more things to worry about. As the guards led me inside, part of me hoped that Alpha Dean would return soon. I could get some answers. The other part of me, however, wanted to be as far away from him as possible. First, the moon goddess gave me an abusive father, and then she gave me Alpha Dean as a mate. My pathetic life was surely a joke to her. The guards carefully unlocked the doors and led me inside Alpha Dean's quarters. The entrance led straight into the living room, where I quickly noticed that his wing was decorated very similarly to the rest of our pack house, dark woods, black decor, but Alpha Dean's wing also had accents of white here and there in the tiniest places. It was a beautiful area, but one should expect nothing less than the best for an Alpha. You will stay here until the Alpha returns from the ball, one of the guards said to me for the first time. I stared up at him with wide eyes and slowly nodded. I was sure I looked like a scared child, but Alpha Dean's men were nearly as intimidating as he was. After that, the guards left without another word. I heard them lock the door behind them, and although that was a bit unsettling, at least I knew my father couldn't get in there. Alpha Dean would surely be just as bad as father, but for now, at least, I was safe, and it was quiet. I walked around the living room, taking in the beautiful architecture and design, but I was careful not to touch anything. I didn't want to anger Alpha Dean in any way. As I wandered through the room, I found myself approaching the hallway. It appeared that there were 4 doors connected to the hallway, which were likely extra bedrooms and possibly an office or spare bathroom, since the kitchen and dining area were open to the living room. I was tempted to venture down the hallway and open the closed doors, but I was too afraid of stumbling across something not meant for my eyes. Alpha Dean was both mysterious and dangerous. I couldn't risk falling into any adverse situations. After reeling in my curiosity, I decided to sit on the couch and patiently wait for Alpha Dean's arrival. Surely there was no harm in simply sitting on his couch? My small body sank into the plush material rather quickly. It practically engulfed me, but it was amazingly comfortable. I was sure I'd never felt such a comfortable piece of furniture in my life. All the furniture that father and I had was old and worn down. I was always grateful for the things I had. My father made sure of that, but it was hard not to be envious of Alpha Dean's lavish lifestyle now that I was aware of it. I sat and stared at the wall ahead of me for quite some time, taking in the intricate details of the fireplace and bookshelves. One thing I quickly noticed was that there were no pictures. From what I'd seen, Alpha Dean didn't have one photo of family or even himself in his quarters. I hadn't even seen any artwork. Nothing that may hold emotions or personal connections. Although I found this interesting and even odd, it wasn't entirely surprising. Alpha Dean had never presented himself as a warm individual with close family ties. I didn't even know if he had any family besides his father, our former Alpha. I wasn't entirely sure how long I sat there and analyzed Alpha Dean's living room, but what I did know was that at some point I dozed off. Because the next thing I knew, I was awoken by the sound of a man with a rather deep, gruff voice, clearing his throat. My eyes snapped open, and I sat up straight on the couch, feeling a bit disoriented at first as I refamiliarized myself with these new surroundings. That was when my eyes met his. Alpha Dean was standing in front of me, only 3 or 4 feet away, staring down at me with his 2 different colored eyes. The blue one sparkled the slightest bit, almost seeming amused, but the brown one was too deep and dark to make out any emotions. His face, however, remained hard. "I hope you enjoyed your nap," he finally spoke. His deep voice was both alluring and terrifying, causing a variety of conflicting emotions to run through my mind. I didn't speak. I only stared. Alpha Dean stared back, remaining silent as well. We were both thoroughly confused and conflicted, unsure of what to do, how to act, and what to say. I was still anticipating anger and rage. It would surely come. Breaking the thick silence, Alpha Dean sighed, moved towards the couch, and took a seat on the opposite end. I flinched away, allowing my body to sink further into the corner of the sofa between 2 cushions. I hadn't been anticipating his movements, or for him to come so close. He looked over at me, seemingly confused by my actions, which only confused and concerned me further. "Your name is Audrey Allen," he said again. He'd done some digging. I nodded slowly, staring into his eyes once again. It wasn't very comforting to hold his gaze, but at the same time, I couldn't look away. There was no denying our bond. I could feel it between us now, despite the lack of contact. I would ask how I've never seen you before. How I hadn't found you sooner, but seeing as you were working with the Omegas, that answer is rather obvious, Alpha Dean said, his jaw slightly clenched. It seemed he didn't like the fact that I'd been working with the Omegas. More silence. How was I supposed to respond to that? His emotions were nearly impossible to judge. It was taking every ounce of control I had not to turn into a shaking, crying mess. Being in his presence, even though he appeared calm, was just as terrifying as being around my father. How was I to know whether or not this large, powerful man would blow up at any moment? "I didn't think I'd ever find you," he said, his voice now slightly softer. "And now that I have," he paused, failing to finish his thought. He didn't have to. I knew what he must be thinking. Now that he had found me, he didn't know what to do. He was expecting someone of a higher rank, surely. Someone strong, just like him, but he got me instead. Weak. Broken. My thoughts sent me into an emotional downward spiral. A tear slipped from my eye and trailed down my cheek, revealing how weak I truly was. Out of instinct, Alpha Dean slid across the couch and reached out to me in an attempt to wipe away my tears. And out of instinct, I jumped up from the couch and moved behind a nearby chair for protection. The look on his face tugged at my heart, confusion, hurt, anger. But that expression quickly hardened, and both of his eyes darkened. A low growl sounded from the back of his throat as he stood from the couch and stormed across the room towards the hallway. I heard the sound of one of the doors opening, and then I heard it being slammed shut. My body began to tremble uncontrollably. I'd made him angry. We'd only just met, and I'd already managed to make him angry. A few minutes later, I heard several loud crashes come from the room Alpha Dean was in. These sounds caused me to cower even further behind the large chair, and several more tears to slip from my eyes. He was furious indeed, and he'd be coming for me next. 10 more minutes passed, and I found myself curled in a ball, hugging my knees to my chest behind the living room chair that somehow made me feel safer. The sound of crashes had ceased, and there was nothing but silence for quite some time. Then I heard a door open, followed by the sound of footsteps. I squeezed my eyes closed, anticipating the worst. The footsteps gradually got closer, causing my trembling to increase significantly. This was it. This is what I'd been expecting all along. Then, the footsteps stopped in front of me. "Audrey," he said. The anger had vanished from his voice, but so had the softness that I'd noticed earlier. "It's getting late. We need to go to bed." "We?" I slowly opened my damp eyes and looked up at him from my position on the floor. His face now lacked any evident emotion as he looked down at me, expecting my obedience. I hesitantly stood up, struggling to fight against my own shaking body. I wish it were something I could control, but I simply couldn't during stressful times. Alpha Dean motioned for me to follow him, and I complied, not wishing to anger him any more tonight. We entered the hallway, and he led me to the very last door on the right, then opened it and allowed me to walk inside. It was a massive bedroom decorated in the same style as the rest of his residence. A king-size bed was positioned against the furthest wall, and it appeared to be just as plush as the couch I'd fallen asleep on earlier. Perhaps I could get a good night's rest despite the day's whirlwind of events. This is our bedroom. The bathroom is the door to your left. Feel free to clean up and get yourself ready for bed, he said casually. Our bedroom? I had to sleep with him. So much for my hopes of a pleasant slumber. I could only hope that he was a decent enough man to not proceed with the rest of our mating process tonight. However, I couldn't understand why else he'd want me to sleep with him in his bed. I thought about questioning him, but quickly decided against it, reminding myself that I didn't need to anger him anymore tonight. I nodded and scurried into the bathroom, shutting the door behind me. I saw that he'd laid out one of his t-shirts and a pair of shorts for me to wear to bed, and although I was grateful for the seemingly kind gesture, I wasn't sure how I felt about wearing his clothes. Forcing myself to stop thinking, I quickly slipped on the t-shirt and shorts, which immediately overwhelmed me with Alpha Dean's intoxicating scent. It was both comforting and unnerving. I couldn't even think straight. Get it together, Audrey, I mumbled to myself before reaching for the toothpaste and toothbrush that had been set out next to the clothing. After thoroughly brushing my teeth and scrubbing the bit of smeared makeup off my face, I quietly opened the bathroom door and saw that Alpha Dean was already in bed. He had the covers pulled back on the empty side of the bed, signaling me to get in. I swallowed hard, trying to resist the overwhelming urge to cry or hyperventilate. I'd never shared a bed with anyone before, and I'd certainly never been this close to someone like Alpha Dean. His being my mate didn't excuse who he was as a person. I slowly crawled into the bed and pulled the blankets up to my chin for comfort. I could feel his warmth against my back, although we weren't touching. My wolf yearned for us to be closer to our mate. She begged me to curl up in his arms, but that could not happen. The very thought made me want to run far away, and I'm sure Alpha Dean... The next morning, I woke up to an empty bed, which was both disappointing and a relief. I wouldn't have known how to react if we'd woken up at the same time, but I did not doubt that it would have been an uncomfortable situation. I wasted no time crawling out of the large bed to get ready for the day. I was used to being up much earlier and having hectic days full of cooking and cleaning, but since Alpha Dean was no longer allowing me to work, I suddenly realized that I had no clue what to do with my day. After brushing my teeth, I wandered into the kitchen to find a small morning snack. I considered cooking a large breakfast, but then realized there was no one to serve it to. I certainly couldn't eat much on my own. Besides, Alpha Dean may not like me using his kitchen. I let out a sigh as I walked around the living room, still wearing his shirt and shorts from last night. Standing at the large living room window, I took a moment to admire the large trees that surrounded us. It had been forever since I'd been able to go outside. My wolf and I were itching for a run, but we knew not to set our hopes on such a thing. A loud, pounding knock on the front door pulled me from my thoughts, effectively making me jump. I quickly walked to the door and stood on my toes to look out the peephole. One of the guards from yesterday was standing outside, so I slowly opened the door, assuming it was for me. Ms. Allen, your presence has been requested in the Alpha's office. He wants me to escort you there. My eyes widened at his statement, but I complied, stepping outside the door and carefully shutting it behind me. I didn't have a clue why Alpha Dean would want me to come to his office, but it certainly didn't sound like a good thing. Perhaps this was the moment I'd been anticipating. Possibly after last night, Alpha Dean was now convinced that he needed to reject me. Chapter 3. Luckily, Alpha Dean's office was on the same floor, so our walk didn't take much time at all, and for that, I was thankful. The awkwardness that radiated between me and his stone-cold guards was extremely uncomfortable. Once we approached the door, the guard knocked loudly, and the sound of Alpha Dean yelling "Enter" from the other side immediately followed. The guard nodded to me as he pushed the door open and allowed me to walk inside. His office was decorated very similarly to his quarters, with various dark elements and flecks of white scattered throughout. I quickly took in my surroundings before focusing my attention on the powerful man in front of me, my mate. He stood behind his desk, obviously awaiting my presence, before motioning to the chair in front of his desk, requesting that I take a seat. I obeyed and sat down across from him, only the large, wooden desk between us, as Alpha Dean sat in his plush office chair. We stared at each other again. That seemed to be all we were good at. Feeling brave, I decided to speak up. "Alpha Dean," I started, clearing my throat a bit. "You requested my presence?" "Please, just call me Dean, Audrey," he replied, his deep voice sounding slightly irritated. I nodded and gave him an apologetic look. Our first conversation of the day, and I'd already disappointed him. "I just wanted to ask you a few questions," he said, grabbing a pen and a small notepad. "What size clothing do you wear?" "I'm sending one of my personal servants out to buy you some new clothes today." I continued to stare at him, completely baffled by his words. "I don't know." Dean furrowed his eyebrows at me, but that was an honest answer. I'd had the same clothing for years at a time, and most of them were hand-me-downs from the Omegas I worked with. Nothing fit appropriately. "When was the last time you went shopping, Audrey?" he asked. I had to think hard about that question because, once again, I had no idea. It would have had to have been when my mother was still alive. My cheeks heated up, turning a shade of deep pink, as I was embarrassed about the answer I was about to give. "About 10 years ago," I said softly, my voice barely a whisper. Alpha Dean's expression was completely unreadable. His eyes had darkened very slightly, as something about my answer seemed to anger him. At the same time, however, he seemed confused. I couldn't blame him. There was no way he could have known about the life I'd come from with my father. "Very well then," Dean mumbled, deciding not to question me further. "I'll just estimate, and we can go from there." He scribbled down several things on his notepad before looking back up at me with inquisitive eyes. "What do you like to do, little mate?" This time, I was the one furrowing my eyebrows. What did I like to do? For the past 10 years, all I'd done was cook and clean. I did enjoy cooking, but something told me that wasn't the kind of answer Dean was looking for. My only memories of fun, enjoyable activities were from when I was a child, and those things no longer interested me. Sensing my confusion and expecting an answer like my previous one, Dean spoke up again. "If you could spend your free time doing something, what would it be? Do you enjoy reading? Writing?" I thought over his question carefully, although I wasn't sure why such trivial things mattered to him. I believed I would like reading and writing, but they seemed like tasks that would bore me after a while. "Reading and writing are fine," I replied softly. "But I think I would enjoy art." Dean nodded as he scribbled down something on his notepad once again. His confused and slightly angered expression never changed, but he seemed satisfied that I'd given him an answer. "What are your favorite foods, Audrey?" Why was Alpha Dean asking me all of these personal questions? They were hard for me, as I wasn't sure about the answers to any of them. I didn't eat much. I typically had one meal per day, which was usually leftovers from the packaged meals we prepared. Father never kept food in our apartment, and even if he did, it was specifically for him. I shrugged. "I'm not picky, Dean." "Dean," he quickly corrected, with a low growl. My cheeks heated up once again, and I quickly looked down at my lap, focusing on my fingers as I twiddled them back and forth. "I'm going to have them restock the kitchen in my quarters today as well. As my mate, I'd like you to have dinner prepared for us every night by the time I get home. Our servants will take care of the cleaning, as I never want you to have such a demeaning job ever again." "Okay," I whispered. I could cook dinner for him every night. That would surely help keep me busy, but the fact that he saw cleaning as demeaning was both confusing and a bit hurtful. My eyes began to well up with tears, despite my desperate attempts to hold them back. Perhaps my mate truly did think lowly of me. Almost as if he sensed my tears, Alpha Dean spoke again. "Audrey, look at me," he commanded. I hesitantly looked up at him, instantly locking eyes. His expression softened only slightly when he noticed my tears. "If you're going to be the Luna of this pack, you must behave like a Luna, and I certainly will not have my Luna scrubbing toilets and mopping floors or associating with Omegas." I nodded again, unable to speak for fear of my voice cracking. Although Alpha Dean had just somewhat confirmed that he didn't plan to reject me, he'd also confirmed that I wasn't the mate he was expecting. I was disappointed. That was nothing new to me, but for it to be confirmed by my mate was heartbreaking. Sensing that I was upset, Dean stood from his chair and pushed it back before walking around his desk to stand near me. He grabbed the chair I was in and turned it around so that I was facing him before kneeling to my level. Dean reached out to tilt my chin up, but I flinched away. I didn't want to be this close. It was threatening. I wanted to run out of his office, but he had me caged in. I slumped down further in the chair as the tears broke free from my eyes. Alpha Dean froze before standing back up and taking a step back. A loud growl erupted from his throat, causing me to snap my head up and look at him before cringing away once more. "Why do you do this?" he yelled, demanding answers. "Why won't you let me touch you? I am your mate, Audrey." The tears came out faster as his voice grew louder, and I was now trembling in fear. I had made him angry yet again. Dean didn't know my past. He didn't understand that the only male touch I'd ever received caused pain. He didn't know that his yelling was all too familiar to me. If he knew of my past, he would surely see me as broken and reject me. Then again, maybe I should let him. He was a terrifying man, and I didn't know if I could spend my life with someone like that, living in constant fear. Although I knew if I didn't have Dean, I'd have to go back to my father. At least Alpha Dean hadn't physically hurt me, yet. My wolf and every fiber of my being yearned to be with him, though. The bond between us was completely undeniable, and it made me feel as if I was going insane. Part of me wanted to run far away, while the other part wanted nothing more than to fall into his embrace. But would he truly embrace me? Answer me. Dean's voice boomed again, shaking me from my thoughts. "I can't." I stuttered. I always sounded pathetic when I stuttered, but in moments like these, it was inevitable. I couldn't explain all of this to him. There were no words. I didn't talk about my past. I couldn't. Even if I could, it'd only make things worse between us. If that was even possible. Dean huffed angrily, his eyes now pitch black. "Return to my quarters, Audrey, and don't leave. I will see you later this evening." I stood up from the chair, shakily, and scurried out of his office. Once I returned to the Alpha's wing, I realized what a relief it was to be alone. Sure, it was boring and lonely, but I couldn't have handled any more conflict with Dean for the time being. Being around him was almost as unnerving as being around my father. Except for the mate bond that demanded to be acknowledged and the fact that Dean still hadn't physically hurt me during one of his angry fits, which I didn't completely understand. How could such a strong, powerful alpha refrain from getting physical with me when angry, but my father couldn't? I settled down on the plush couch that I'd fallen in love with the day before and reached for the control of the TV. We only had one TV in our apartment, and it was in Father's room, so I didn't have the luxury of enjoying it. Thankfully, I remembered how to use the remote from my childhood and was soon flipping through the channels. I figured that for the time being, this would be the best way to both entertain and distract me. About 30 minutes into watching a National Geographic documentary, I heard someone come in through the front door. It seemed much too early for Dean to be back, so I spun around to see several women coming in through the door, carrying a variety of items, including clothing, bags, and plastic grocery sacks. "Why, hello, dear. We're just here to deliver some clothing, groceries, and other necessities to you at the Alpha's request, one of the servants told me. She appeared to be middle-aged and had a surprisingly friendly face. The other 3 women scurried off in different directions to put away the items they had carried in. "What's your name, dear?" "I've heard talk that we finally have a Luna," the middle-aged woman spoke again, shooting me a warm smile as she began to place food in the pantry. My face turned bright red at her comment. I didn't know that other pack members knew about Dean and me being mates. Surely the entire pack didn't know already, I hoped. "I'm Audrey," I told her, my voice coming out soft and shy. "Well, it's lovely to meet you, Audrey. My name is Helen. I'm Alpha Dean's personal servant, and the other ladies you saw come and work under me. I'm always nearby if you need anything at all." I nodded to her with a small smile. It was refreshing to be in the presence of such a nice woman. Laurel was the only other kind soul I'd been around, and although we weren't exactly close friends, I was beginning to miss her. After the servants finished their duties, they left just as quickly and quietly as they came. Now that the kitchen was stocked with fresh food, I decided perhaps it was time to work on dinner for Dean. Maybe that would help mend things from earlier. I began rummaging through the refrigerator and pantry, sorting through ingredients before finally settling on chicken parmesan with spaghetti. It was a classic meal, one that you couldn't go wrong with. When I was about halfway done cooking the meal, I heard the front door open again. I stepped back from the stove to look and saw Dean walking in. He was on the phone but paused to look over at me, giving me a nod. I suppose that was his way of acknowledging dinner before he continued down the hallway and into the bedroom, only shutting the door halfway. I don't know why his being on the phone intrigued me. He was an alpha after all. He had phone calls to take all the time. Regardless, I found myself wandering towards the hallway, only close enough to the bedroom for me to hear his voice. "She's just so scared and emotional, and weak," Dean said to whoever he was on the phone with. I felt like my heart stopped as tears filled my eyes for the second time today. My mate did think I was weak. I just don't know what to do. I don't know how to get through to her. I don't know why she acts the way she does. I don't understand any of it. The tears began flowing down my cheeks even harder than earlier. He was talking about me to someone else. Most of what he was saying truly wasn't a big deal, but he called me weak. I heard it myself. "Thank you, Wyatt. Please do tell Rhett to give me a call." Knowing that the phone call was ending, I hurried back to the kitchen, crying all the while. I heard his footsteps approaching as I was dishing up his dinner plate, and I knew he could hear my sniffles. When I looked up from the plate to look at him, he was holding a large sketch pad and several books in his hands, staring at me. "What happened now?" he asked, his voice laced with both irritation and concern. I hesitated to reply as the sniffles progressed and the tears came faster. "I'm weak." Chapter 4. Needless to say, dinner didn't go as planned. I continued to cry like the weak she-wolf I was, and Dean continued to stare at me. He honestly didn't know what to do. He didn't know how to react to me, how to comfort me, how to talk to me, but I couldn't blame him. I was terrified to let him near me. It was a whirlwind of ever-changing emotions. The truth of the matter was that none of this was even really his fault. It was me. I was the problem. We didn't speak for the rest of the night. I finally stopped crying as I sat at the dining room table across from Dean. He ate his food quickly and quietly, but I couldn't even touch mine. When he finished, he looked over at me as if he wanted to tell me to eat, but he didn't speak a word. He simply stood from the table and retreated to the bedroom. Once he was out of the room, I stood from the table and proceeded to put away the leftovers. Perhaps tomorrow, I'll have more of an appetite, and I could eat some for lunch. I then cleaned the kitchen and put the dishes in the dishwasher, wasting as much time as possible so that maybe Dean would already be asleep by the time I got to bed. I never had good luck. I quietly tiptoed into the bedroom, only to see Dean sitting up in bed on his laptop. He was wearing only his boxers, allowing me a full view of his sculpted chest and arms. He was a gorgeous creature. Beautiful but deadly. My wolf licked her lips, loving the sight of her exposed mate. I blushed at the provocative thoughts she was having and lightly scolded her. She would never see Dean in the same light as I. I kept my head down, staring at my feet as I scurried into the bathroom to get ready for bed. Unfortunately, that's not too long a process for me, so I had to return to the bedroom only a couple of minutes later. Dean was still focused on his laptop, but he did glance over at me as I sat on the edge of the bed, preparing myself to scoot under the covers. "We have some visitors coming in the morning," he said softly, turning his attention back to his laptop. "Visitors? From another pack?" Dark Root rarely had relations with the other packs. Besides that, why were these visitors relevant to me? I nodded slowly, not sure how to respond to the information. "You're going to meet someone I think you'll really like. She's a Luna from another pack," Dean informed me, failing to elaborate any further. Me? I was going to meet someone. A Luna of all people? Although Dean just said I'd like her, I now found myself feeling incredibly nervous. Why did I have to meet her? I wasn't ready to be a Luna yet. I'd surely embarrass myself and this pack. I didn't even realize I'd begun trembling and rocking myself back and forth ever so slightly until Dean reached out and gently placed his hand on my bare shoulder. The sparks from our mate bond erupted on my skin, calming me a bit, but I still couldn't help but flinch away. "Tell me what's wrong now," Dean requested, his voice stern but still soft. Why am I meeting a Luna? I'll only make a fool of myself and this pack. I'm not Luna material. Not yet, I explained as best as I could. Dean let out a long sigh and pinched the bridge of his nose. "All of that is beside the point, Audrey. They're not coming to visit for pack business. I just thought it'd be nice for you to meet another female. Perhaps you two could become friends." I stared at Dean, yet again, not knowing how to respond. Did he invite them here for me? He wanted me to have a friend. My heart warmed a bit as I thought about what a kind gesture it was. I nodded to him as my tremors finally disappeared. I slid further back on the bed and slipped my feet under the blankets before pulling the soft fabric up under my chin. "Thank you," I whispered to Dean, although I wasn't sure if he heard me. He slowly glanced over at me, informing me that he did indeed hear me. He looked down at me for a moment, holding my eyes with his before nodding in understanding. My eyes finally fluttered closed as his scent took over my senses, causing me to fully relax. The next morning, when I woke, Dean was coming out of the bathroom. His dampened hair and the trickles of water on his forehead told me that he had just got out of the shower, and I figured I should do the same. If we were having visitors, I had to make a good impression. I had to try my hardest not to mess anything up. "I have to go to the office until our guests get here." "Go ahead and do whatever you need to do," Dean said to me as he moved towards the closet and picked out a shirt. Dean slipped the shirt on over his head and walked back out of the closet. "I requested that Helen get you a drawing pad and some supplies yesterday. They should still be in the kitchen. That should help keep you occupied." Of course, that must have been the items Dean was carrying last night when he entered the kitchen. I was too caught up in my own emotions and weakness to notice that, yet again, my mate was making a nice gesture for me. "Yes, thank you," I responded softly as I slid out of bed. Dean nodded before turning around and exiting the room. A few seconds later, I heard the front door close, indicating that Dean had left. I quickly entered the bathroom, took a shower, and then got dressed, applying just a tiny bit of makeup. I wanted to look presentable, but I certainly wasn't trying to impress anyone. After I got myself cleaned up, I went to the kitchen and grabbed a granola bar from the pantry before moving to the dining area to find the art supplies that Dean had got for me. Everything was still in the bag, so I began to sort through the items one by one. There were a couple of large sketch pads, followed by colored pencils, charcoal, watercolor paints, a few canvases, and a couple of art-related books. Although I knew Dean hadn't picked any of this out for me himself, something told me that he told Helen and the other servants to get me the absolute best, and they had. I grabbed a sketch pad and some pencils before moving over to the couch. I'd never had time for any hobbies, so this was exciting to me. For a while, I didn't have a clue what to draw. It's not like I'd experienced many things in my life, and the memories I did have were often negative. I didn't have to draw negative things, did I? No, I needed to reinvent myself. I started out trying to draw some flowers, but I found myself feeling lost. The types of flowers I'd seen were very limited. I knew of daisies and violets, but that was about it. I squeezed my eyes shut hard and tried to imagine a daisy. They were cute little flowers, but that was about it. Just cute. Something told me there were more beautiful flowers out there. As I was on my floor, I heard the front door creak open. I quickly turned my head in the direction of the front door, my eyes wide as I took in whoever was entering. Dean surely wouldn't be back so soon, and I couldn't imagine who else would be coming in unless it was Helen. A young woman whom I'd never seen before slowly entered the room, quietly shutting the door behind her. She was gorgeous. She had long, golden blonde hair with a slight red tint and fair skin. She appeared to be only a few inches taller than I was, but her most distinguishable feature was her large, rounded belly. Slowly, she approached the couch. Was this the visitor Dean had mentioned to me? I studied her as she walked my way with a faint smile on her face. "Hello, Audrey," she said, her voice light and pleasant. "My name is Hannah." I stared at her for a moment, probably looking like a complete freak. She was so beautiful and radiated the essence of a faithful Luna. She was everything I wanted to be. Hi, I said quietly, sitting up on the couch and setting my sketch pad on the coffee table. Hannah beamed at my response. "Were you expecting me?" I raised an eyebrow at her. "Are you a Luna?" Hannah chuckled before walking around the couch and taking a seat in a nearby chair. "Yes, I'm the Luna of Blue Mountain Pack. Alpha Rhett is my mate." "Then yes, Dean did tell me we were expecting a visitor today," I told her truthfully. "I thought we could get to know each other. You know, girl talk," Hannah said, still smiling the whole time. I tried to imagine what it'd be like having a life where I always wanted to smile. "Well, Dean obviously put you up to this," I stated, feeling a bit bold since I was in the presence of another friendly female. "What does he want to know?" Hannah shot me a look, almost like she was impressed with my instincts. "Dean did ask me to come here, Audrey, but I'm not going to tell him anything you don't want me to. This is between me and you." I nodded. She seemed sincere, but I couldn't trust anyone. "Where are you from, Audrey?" she asked, carrying on the conversation. "Here," I replied. "I was born and raised here in Dark Root." Hannah furrowed her eyebrows at me. "But you and Alpha Dean just met?" I didn't get out much, I mumbled. Hannah's look of suspicion only got more intense. "Tell me what's really going on, Audrey. Dean told me you're scared to death, and something tells me that this is all connected." I stared at her again. She was certainly a smart, intuitive Luna, truly perfect for her position. I sighed and braced myself as I prepared to tell Hannah about some of my life. I wouldn't go into detail, of course, as she was still basically a stranger to me. My mother died when I was 10, so it was just my father and I. He wasn't a very kind man after she died, I explained timidly. Hannah's eyes visibly softened as I spoke. She knew. I barely had to say a thing, and she knew. "I'm sorry to hear that. My mother passed away about a year ago, but I can't say I've had exactly the same issues with my father," Hannah replied sympathetically. "Are you going to tell Dean?" I asked quietly. Hannah's face fell. "He deserves to know, Audrey, and it's quite apparent that you're too afraid to tell him. He's worried about you. Don't you think your relationship would benefit from him understanding you a bit better?" I felt tears form in my eyes. Hannah was right, but I was terrified. "He will be mad. All I do is make him angry," I said as a sob escaped my mouth. Hannah immediately moved close to me, wrapping a comforting arm around my shoulder. "Alphas are the most temperamental of all werewolf men, Audrey. They're more protective, more possessive, and more angry, but most importantly, they love harder than imaginable. I don't even like Dean." Him asking Rhett and I to come here just for you shows how much he cares for you. He doesn't ask anyone for help, especially when he knows they don't respect him. I listened to Hannah's words intently and took the time to consider them carefully. I knew she was right, but I couldn't just change who I was overnight. I sniffled and wiped away the tears that had escaped before looking back over to Hannah. You can tell him. I'm not ready yet, but you're right. He deserves to know, I told her. Hannah's smile reappeared instantly. Having a mate is one of the best experiences of your life, Audrey. I promise. I nodded, trying my best to trust her words. Hannah stood from the chair and I knew where she was headed. She was going back to tell Dean what she'd learned. Hannah, I called before she started walking away. She paused and raised an eyebrow at me. Congratulations, I said, gesturing towards her round, pregnant belly. Hannah blushed and giggled softly as her hands came down to rest on her stomach instinctively. Thank you, Audrey. I'd love for you to meet him when he's born. My eyes widened. Him. Yes, she replied. I'm carrying the future heir of Blue Mountain Pack. Her voice was full of pride as her smile grew even wider. I smiled back as my tears finally stopped. Hannah was such a delightful individual. My brief encounter with her was enough to encourage me and give me hope. But as she walked back towards the front door, I felt my anxiety growing once more. In a matter of minutes, Dean would know the truth about me. Even without knowing the details, he would know of my troubled past. Chapter 5. I paced the living room as I waited for someone to come back inside. I knew someone would come, most likely Dean. Anticipating his reaction to the information Hannah gave him was eating away at me. Would he be angry? Would he yell? Would he even care? Should I expect him to? I'm broken beyond repair. All I'd honestly expect of him would be to reject me and find someone stronger to take as a mate. Eventually, the pacing grew tiresome, and I feared I'd wear a path on the floor. I wasn't sure exactly how much time had passed, but it felt like hours. I'd expected someone to come storming in long before now. I finally decided to just take a seat on the couch and stare blankly at the wall in front of me. I thought about turning on the TV, but I knew I wouldn't really be able to pay attention to it. My mind was consumed by a whirlwind of thoughts. I then heard a light noise at the front door. Although I'd only been staying here a few days, I instantly recognized it as the sound the doorknob made right before someone was about to unlock the door. My eyes widened, and my whole body was on alert. This was it. This is what I'd been anticipating. Dean's reaction would finally be revealed. My heart rate quickened as I heard the doorknob turn, and I slowly turned around to face the front door, expecting to see Dean. Instead, I was greeted by Hannah once again. Let's get you ready for dinner, she said with a chipper tone as if she didn't realize I was expecting Dean to come storming in rather than her. Catching on to my confusion, she raised an eyebrow. What's the matter? That's it. I blurted out. Hannah continued to stare at me with a look full of questions. You said you'd tell Dean of my past, but he hasn't even made an appearance in here since this morning, and now you've come back telling me it's time for dinner? Hannah sighed and nodded. Dean wasn't pleased with what I told him, but we managed to convince him to take some time to cool off, rather than coming back here to see you. I felt a bit relieved at Hannah's words, and I truly appreciated the gesture. Every time I saw Dean angry, it would send my mind back to its dark place. Being away from my father, even if only for a few days, had helped bring some light and clarity to my mind, but Dean seemed to make it cloud over again. I wanted to trust Hannah's advice. I wanted to feel incredible from being with my mate and becoming a Luna, but I didn't know how to just yet. I was still trying to learn and understand, and every time Dean lost himself in a fit of rage, it felt like I was taking 2 steps backward. Thank you, I told her softly. Hannah smiled and nodded before reaching out and gently grabbing my hand. She tugged me towards the bedroom and immediately went for the closet, rummaging through the large amount of clothing that I now owned. Why are we getting dressed up for dinner? I asked, noticing Hannah had already changed into a baby pink maxi dress that outlined her baby bump perfectly. Dean is having a dinner for us as his guests," she told me as she pulled a forest green dress out of the closet and held it up to my body. I felt my muscles clench. I didn't know if I was ready to make an appearance in front of the pack yet as Alpha Dean's mate. I wasn't ready to be introduced as Luna, and I certainly wasn't ready to risk seeing my father. Hannah raised an eye at me, sensing my change in demeanor. "It's just going to be us. Me, you, Dean, my mate, Rhett, and his brother, Wyatt." I let out a sigh of relief, not even bothering to mask it. Something about Hannah made me trust her. She obviously already knew how I was feeling, so there was no point in hiding my emotions. "Wear this. I think it'll really make your eyes pop," Hannah told me, handing me the dark green dress and shooing me into the bathroom as she began to dig through boxes of shoes. I wasn't sure why she thought this lovely green would make my eyes pop. They were just brown, after all. But once again, I trusted Hannah, and I certainly had more faith in her fashion knowledge than I did my own. Once inside the bathroom, I tossed my clothes into the nearby hamper and slipped on the dress. It fell to mid-thigh and fit my body perfectly. Although I was a bit lacking in womanly curves due to not eating very often, the dress somehow gave me a boost of confidence that I'd never experienced before. It fit snugly around my breasts and flowed out around my hips, giving me the illusion of an hourglass figure. The green not only made my eyes appear more golden brown rather than their normal dull color, but it also seemed to make my skin tone glow. Taking in my reflection in the mirror, I did something that didn't happen all too often. I smiled. I truly loved the way I looked in the dress. It gave me a wave of confidence that I rarely felt. I quickly reached for my hairbrush and brushed through my hair, allowing my dark brown hair to fall loosely in its natural, subtle waves. Feeling bold, I pulled open the drawer filled with makeup and applied a bit of mascara and blush. Perhaps this put-together look would brighten Dean's mood a bit. Then again, I wasn't sure if he found me attractive in the first place. I finally left the bathroom and found Hannah standing outside the door with a pair of strappy, tan heels in her hands. My eyes widened. I've never walked in heels before. Hannah chuckled lightly and shook her head as she walked back to the closet and pulled out a pair of strappy tan sandals instead. If I were going to try to make a good impression not only in front of my mate, but in front of the alpha of another pack, I couldn't be stumbling around everywhere. I took the shoes from Hannah and sat down on the edge of the bed so I could slip them onto my feet. They fit just as perfectly as the dress had, which showed Dean had done a good job estimating my sizes. I had no idea how he got so spot on. I don't think I would have even been able to do that good of a job estimating for myself. "You look beautiful," Hannah squealed before pushing me in front of the full-body mirror on the closet door. I took a moment to observe myself, really taking in all of my features. I couldn't help but agree with Hannah a little bit. I did look very nice. Then again, I rarely had the opportunity to dress up. "Thank you," I replied to her, unable to hide the faint blush appearing on my cheeks. "You don't need to thank me for anything," Hannah said. "Now, let's get downstairs, shall we? We're starving." Hannah gestured to her large, pregnant belly, causing a soft giggle to escape me. I followed her out of the room, down the hallway to the front door, and outside to the grand staircase. The main dining hall was on the first floor near the main entrance of the pack house, but since this was a smaller gathering, I assumed we'd be eating in one of the Alpha's personal dining rooms that were designed especially for guests. Working with the Omegas, we regularly cleaned the personal dining areas, but they were rarely used since Darkroot had little to no allies. Although I knew my way around the public areas of the pack house, Hannah seemed very sure of where she was going, so I allowed her to lead the way. I, for one, wasn't going to get in the way of a pregnant she-wolf and her meal. Hannah took a sharp right once we got down the stairs and headed towards the back of the pack house, where the meeting rooms and other private areas were located. We then found ourselves in front of a set of double doors, and Hannah didn't hesitate to shove them open, revealing 3 men sitting at a long dining table. Dean was sitting at the head of the table with an open seat to his right, presumably for me. Across from him sat another very large man who radiated the power of an alpha just as Dean did. He was very tall, even sitting down, and muscular, just as Dean was. He had golden brown hair that seemed to shine in the light and bright blue eyes that stood out in contrast. Seated to his left was a man who looked very similar, only slightly smaller in height and overall size. They shared the same hair and eye color and very similar facial features, but the man at the end of the table had nicely groomed facial hair, while the other did not. Hannah hurried over to the larger man and leaned down to kiss him on the cheek. She beamed at him, and he returned the same loving look, while the man next to them seemed rather indifferent about the couple's interaction. "Audrey, this is my mate, Alpha Red of Blue Mountain," Hannah told me as she wrapped her arm around Rhett's neck. He returned the gesture by wrapping one arm around her waist and resting the other on her large belly. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Audrey." "This is my brother, Wyatt," Rhett said. His voice was deep but very warm and pleasant to the ear. Wyatt looked up and simply nodded to me. I stood there and smiled at the two of them, wanting to make a good impression, but my attention was torn away from them as I noticed Hannah silently gesturing for me to take my seat next to Dean. Cautiously, I approached the chair. Dean watched me the entire way, and I didn't miss the darkness in his eyes, although I couldn't figure out why it was there in the first place. Perhaps Hannah would have an explanation, and I made a mental note to ask her about it later. After I took my seat, Hannah removed herself from her mate and took her seat next to him as well. On cue, the Omegas filed into the room and began to set the trays down on the table, presenting us with our meal for the night. It was so odd being served after years of serving others, especially when I recognized each of their faces so well. On the table sat a large honey ham, piles of mashed potatoes, grilled zucchini and squash, buttered rolls, fettuccine alfredo, and sides of various sauces. My mouth watered at the sight in front of me, although I wouldn't be able to eat but a small fraction of a plate. Dean grabbed my plate and began to dish up my food for me, making me feel a bit like a child, although I knew it was customary for males to serve and feed their mates in front of others. It was one of the ways they demonstrated their care and provision for their mate. I felt my cheeks heat up as Dean set the very full plate down in front of me before beginning to dish up his own. Once he had his food and began to eat, the rest of the table began to serve themselves. It was a sign of respect, of course. The alpha of a pack always ate first, and since Alpha Rhett was a guest, he was to respect that tradition. Thank you all for joining us tonight. It's a pleasure to have you here and introduce you to my mate, Dean finally spoke, his voice deep and gruff as usual. I took a bite of my mashed potatoes as I focused on my mate's words, wondering what else he might have to say during this dinner. I know our packs haven't had the best relations recently, but I'd like to extend a hand of friendship tonight. I truly appreciate your Luna coming to help us today, and I know Audrey must appreciate it as well, Dean said. I nodded in response, as I truly appreciated Hannah's company and conversation. In 2 days, we will have the ceremony to initiate Audrey as the Pax Luna. I extend an invitation to you all to stay and attend. I nearly choked on my food at Dean's words. I met Hannah's gaze from down the table, and she, too, looked both shocked and horrified. I wasn't ready to be introduced to the pack as their Luna, much less formally initiated. I could barely stand to be around my mate alone. There was no telling what a fool I would make of myself in front of hundreds of pack members. My heart rate sped up as I felt another anxiety attack on the horizon. Goddess, I really hadn't wanted to make myself look weak in front of this other alpha. Chapter 6, so soon. I finally managed to squeak out amidst my intense anxiety. I don't think Audrey is ready for that, Alpha Dean. Surely you understand that. After the information you received today, Hannah spoke up, glaring at Dean all the while. Rhett looked a bit anxious as well as he silently tried to convince Luna to stand down. It's time for this pack to have their rightful Luna. I understand that you're not ready to take on all of the roles of a Luna yet, but that doesn't mean you can't participate in the ceremony, Dean said sternly as he continued to eat his meal. I couldn't stop myself. The tears fell. I'd now revealed to the other alpha in the room and our other guests that I was weak. Once the tears started, I couldn't stop them. They flowed down my face like a waterfall, dripping off my chin and onto the green dress I wore. Hannah quickly stood from her seat and walked over to me, wrapping a comforting arm around my shoulder. What did the Luna initiation ceremony even consist of? I knew it was different for every pack, and it was kept top secret. With Dark Root being a bit old-fashioned in their traditions, I felt that the Luna ceremony could be truly terrible for someone like me. I noticed Hannah shoot Red a look, and I assumed they had been mind-linking one another this entire time. I appreciated both Hannah's comfort and desire to stand up for me, although I knew my mate didn't care for it much. In fact, we were lucky that Dean didn't have her thrown out for her audacity. Alpha Rhett cleared his throat. "Dean, I'm afraid we will have to decline your invitation. It's apparent to us that your mate is not ready to participate in your ceremony, and we will not condone you having her do this against her will." My eyes widened at Rhett's words, although the tears remained a steady stream. Alpha Rhett was risking pack relations for me? I knew Hannah had something to do with it, of course, but it still meant a lot to me and warmed my heart. I heard a low growl come from my left and looked over to see Dean's eyes black and jaw clenched. Every muscle in my body tensed as I anticipated his reaction. "My mate is no concern of yours, Rhett, but if you insist on declining my offer, I'll have to insist you vacate my pack first thing in the morning," Dean finally replied, his voice stern. I felt like my airway constricted as I took in his words. They had to leave if they didn't attend the ceremony. I wouldn't have anyone to talk to. What if it was terrible? What if I needed a friend? I'd have no one except for a mate who still didn't understand me. I began to hyperventilate as it didn't feel like air was making it into my lungs. My heart was pounding, likely due to the lack of oxygen. I knew I was making a fool of myself once again, but I couldn't help it. This was all too much. Every time I felt like I saw a glimmer of hope within my and Dean's relationship, it just got crushed all over again. Hannah glanced in my direction and attempted to hide her concern, although I caught on immediately. She was now conflicted. She didn't want to support Dean's ceremony, but she didn't want to leave me by myself either. We'd barely known each other for a day, but we both knew she was all I had. Hannah looked over at Rhett, biting her bottom lip as her conflicting ideas raged on inside her head. I was sure they were probably mind-linking one another again, but I couldn't imagine just how that conversation was going. Rhett seemed to respect his mate's opinions, but he was still an alpha. He had the final say. "If it's okay with you, we're going to discuss the situation overnight. If we decide to attend, you'll be informed first thing in the morning. If not, then we will arrange our ride back home," Rhett told Dean, his voice assertive but calm. Dean stared straight ahead at Rhett, his eyes still dark as he thought over his options. "That sounds fair." Rhett nodded in response, but Hannah still looked uneasy. They exchanged another glance before quietly resuming their meal. The rest of dinner was quiet, other than Wyatt occasionally speaking up to chat with Dean. I remained silent as well. My tears had finally dried up, and I had no desire to make a fool of myself again. Once everyone finished eating, Rhett and Hannah politely dismissed themselves to the guest quarters. Wyatt gave a friendlier goodnight to Dean, and then it was just the two of us left in a room full of empty plates besides my own. "You need to eat more, Audrey." Dean finally spoke directly to me for the first time that evening. His eyes had returned to their normal colors of brown and blue, making me feel slightly more relaxed, but never completely at ease. "I can't," I replied simply and softly. "Well, you're going to learn," Dean replied instantly. "You're unhealthy. The first step in becoming a strong Luna is having a strong body." This time, his words not only hurt, but they also angered me. "I'm never going to be a strong Luna. Don't you see that?" I snapped, raising my voice at him for the first time. It was both terrifying and satisfying. "Your tone begs to differ." I froze. Wasn't he mad? I'm sure in any other circumstance, he would have been furious with me for raising my voice, but in this instance, he almost seemed proud. Forcing me into situations still isn't the best way to go about this, I said, trying to hold my confidence, although I felt it fading by the second. If I don't push you out of your comfort zone, then who will? Dean asked, raising an eyebrow at me. I hated that he was right. Hated it. How could I be upset with him when I knew he was right? I just wish I was good enough as I am, I whispered, looking down at my lap. I heard his chair scoop back, followed by footsteps nearing me. My muscles tensed again as I prepared for his anger. He tolerated me raising my voice, but that comment set him off. Then I felt the warmth of his finger under my chin, followed by the sparks of our mate bond. I wanted to pull away, but I didn't. Not this time. He slowly tilted my chin up so that I was looking him in the eye. You are good enough as you are, but you have the potential for much more. My heart seemed to swell at his words as a comforting warmth possessed my body. Could it be true? Was I good enough for my alpha mate? Surely, he was only trying to make me feel better. Let's get back to our quarters. Dean spoke again after a couple of minutes of silence. I nodded and stood from my chair before following him out of the room. I followed him back to the Alpha's wing, assuming we'd be getting ready for bed. I knew the routine to come, but that didn't make it any easier to accept. Although sleeping next to Dean brought this strange comfort that I couldn't explain, it made me uneasy at the same time. Once we were back upstairs, Dean made his way to the bedroom, gathered some clothes, and then went into the bathroom for a shower. I used this as an opportunity to change into a t-shirt and a pair of red flannel pajama pants before returning to the living room and putting away the sketch pad and supplies I had left out earlier. By the time I made it back to the bedroom, Dean was walking out of the bathroom, shirtless, with a towel draped around his neck. His gym shorts hung low on his hips, making my wolf send rather naughty thoughts through my mind again. I couldn't deny that he was an extremely attractive man. I'd have to be insane to deny that. I blushed as I found myself staring at my mate's body and turned away as quickly as I could. I approached the bed and slid under the covers, only to find that Dean had done the same. For the second time today, he reached over and gently grabbed my chin. Why won't you give me a chance to get close to you? I stared up at him, pondering his question as I tried to ignore the sparks flowing between us. You know why, I answered softly. Dean exhaled loudly and closed his eyes for a moment, contemplating the appropriate reply. I am not your father. I stared at him long and hard. There was a certain power in his words that really held me in the moment. His two heterochromatic eyes had me captivated, and I couldn't think of the proper words to say in reply. He's going to be prosecuted. All of the paperwork is in order. After he sees you become his Luna, he will be arrested by my guards and forced to await a trial, Dean added. My heart began to pound again. Dean was prosecuting my father? I had seen something like this coming, but at the same time, I hadn't. I felt my emotions and anxiety begin to overcome me yet again. Could I not go one day without becoming an emotional mess? No. You can't. He will come for me. I shouted as tears flooded my face for what had to have been the fourth time today. Suddenly, Dean grabbed me by my shoulders, Audrey. I am the alpha of this pack. Your father will never touch you again. I froze, shocked by both his words and actions. Of course, no one could defy their alpha. I knew that, yet I was still worried. My father had traumatized me to such an extent that I doubted my own alpha. Was I insane? In that moment of confusion and weakness, not only did I cry, but I did something I didn't think would ever be possible. I leaned in and buried my face into Dean's chest, embracing his warmth and comforting scent. I saw comfort in my mate. I felt his body tense from the unexpected action, and then he slowly and hesitantly wrapped his arms around me. He held me. We held each other. I focused on the sound of his heart beating and the sparks that engulfed me from his arms touching mine. For the first time in the days we'd known each other, we embraced each other. For the first time, I truly accepted him as my mate. As long as I'm around, no harm will ever come to you, my mate, Dean whispered into my ear before burying his face into my neck. I'd always hoped that this warm, affectionate side of Alpha Dean existed, but I'd never seen it until this moment. More importantly, I'd never given him the chance to show it. I felt at home in his arms. At home was a feeling I'd never felt before. Perhaps as a child, when my mother was still alive, I had thought it, but those memories were faint and distant. This is so hard, I mumbled against his chest. That was a half-truth, of course. It was hard, but it felt natural. Every instinct within me begged for Dean's love and embrace, but another part of me still doubted it. The other part of me told me that this was a dangerous move. My father had once been a good, kind man. He had been a good father. He changed. Nothing good in life is easy, Dean murmured back as he lightly stroked my hair. Was this truly the same man who had ruled my pack for years of my life? Dean loosened his grip on me and laid me back against my pillows before pulling the blankets up to my chin. I blushed at the sweet gesture but managed to maintain my composure. Rest. We have a Luna ceremony to begin preparations for first thing in the morning. Just when I thought my anxiety had vanished for the night, I felt its grip all over again. Dean was determined to have the ceremony, and there was clearly nothing I could do about it. Sensing my worries, Dean carefully wrapped an arm around my waist and pulled my back against his chest. I sighed, feeling comforted but unable to forget my concerns about the ceremony at the same time. This time, however, Dean was the first one to fall asleep. Chapter 7. Much to my dismay, the next morning I awoke to an empty bed. I couldn't help but feel a bit disappointed. After the moment Dean and I had shared the night before, I had been anticipating a pleasant awakening as well. I should have known better than to get my hopes up too fast with someone like him. I did remember him saying that today would be full of preparations for the Luna ceremony, and although I didn't really know what that meant, I knew I should probably try to look presentable. There was no telling who I might have to interact with. I slid out of bed and wandered over to the bathroom to take a quick shower and begin my morning routine. I made an effort to use Dean's shower gel and shampoo again today, as I felt he appreciated it, even though he never commented on it. Once I was out of the shower, I went through my usual routine before applying my hair and makeup. Today, I decided on loose curls and subtle makeup that was put together but natural looking, and the outfit I picked reflected the same idea. I wore a pair of dark skinny jeans with a loose, white blouse and black flats. Upon exiting the bedroom, I was hit with a beautiful, warm aroma. My nose led me to the kitchen, where I found a plate full of warm eggs, bacon, biscuits, and fresh fruit. There was no one in the quarters, so I could only assume that Helen had made me breakfast while I was in the shower. Refusing to let Helen's efforts go unappreciated, I sat down at the bar and ate my meal. I knew I wouldn't be able to finish, but I hoped that everyone was beginning to expect that from me. After eating all the eggs, fruit, and at least half of the bacon and biscuits, I walked to the sink to rinse my plate and place it in the dishwasher. Without any further instructions or even a hint, I had no idea what was expected of me. Dean had said that today was preparation day for the Luna ceremony, but did that even involve me? If he needed me, would he send for me? I honestly had no idea, and I felt that waiting to find out would only fuel my anxiety. I decided to take a chance and be bold. I walked out of our quarters and made my way to his office. Luckily, I had a pretty good sense of direction from all the years of cleaning the pack house. I'd never been to the Alpha's office before discovering he was my mate, but remembering a new bath came naturally to me. Once I found myself outside his office doors, I felt the anxiety building in my stomach. What if this made him angry? After all, we'd never really established what I was and wasn't allowed to do. With my wolf pushing me to be brave, I reached out and softly knocked on the door. Silence. It felt like the silence went on forever. What if he wasn't in his office? He was the Alpha. He could be anywhere. After what felt like half a century, he spoke. Enter, his deep voice called. I took a deep breath and shoved the door open, preparing myself for the worst reaction possible. Anger. Rage. Audrey, Dean said, sounding surprised. Is everything okay? I blinked a few times as I stared across the room at my mate, feeling rather dumbfounded. Wasn't he mad? In fact, he actually seemed concerned. I started, already feeling my words begin to stutter over my tongue. You said that there would be preparations for the ceremony today. I didn't know if you needed me around. After I finally said my piece, I slowly shut the door behind me and approached his desk. You're not a part of the preparations, Dean said simply. His tone always threw me off. He seemed straightforward, but at the same time, he always made me wonder if I was insignificant to him. Oh, I replied quietly as I slowly turned my body back towards the door. That doesn't mean you're not welcome to visit me in my office, Dean added quickly. I paused. He wasn't mad? Did he want me here? Perhaps things were still looking up. I slowly turned around to face him again, unable to hide the astonished expression on my face. Dean stared back at me, his one blue eye flashing with some hidden emotion. The brown one remained dark and mysterious, never revealing too much. Dean motioned for me to have a seat across from him at his desk, and I quickly complied, wanting to keep the positivity flowing between the two of us. Did you eat your breakfast? He asked. I frowned slightly. He truly was troubled by my eating habits. Yes, I replied with a small nod. All of it? I furrowed my eyebrows at him. Well, no, but Dean sighed and shook his head. You really need to work on that, Audrey. You're underweight and malnourished. It worries me. I froze, my eyes locking with his. Did he really just admit that he was concerned about my well-being? My heart fluttered as my wolf began to purr in my head. I feared she was only a few days away from an I told you so moment. I'm sorry, I murmured as I looked down at my lap nervously. It's not your fault, Dean responded without hesitation. I could tell he was thinking about my past. I knew it angered him, but he had done a decent job of keeping his composure around me so far. You deserve to live a happy, healthy life, Audrey, with everything your heart could ever want. I plan to give that to you, if you'll allow me to. I felt my eyes begin to water at his words. Emotions began to engulf me, but for the first time, they weren't negative. I was simply overwhelmed by the kindness Dean was showing me. If only things had been this way from the first day we met, although I had been the main reason for our bad beginning. But will I be good enough for you? I finally worked up the courage to ask, my voice soft and hesitant. Dean was silent for a moment, causing a pit of anxiety to form in my stomach. You're my mate. You were made for me. Although I felt that was his way of assuring me that I was good enough, his choice of words and hesitance still caused me to worry. Regardless, I forced a smile and nodded. In a little while, Helen will be fitting you for your dress. The ceremony will be held very late tonight, Dean informed me, changing the subject. My eyes widened. Tonight. I thought the ceremony was scheduled for tomorrow? I blurted out, my anxiety taking over once again. I thought I'd have more time to prepare myself. Well, it's traditionally held at 2 a.m, which is tomorrow, Dean replied casually, not seeing the problem I had with this situation. After dinner, Hannah will help you get ready for the ceremony, he added, likely hoping that his statement would calm me down. Luckily for him, it did. That meant Hannah and Rhett had decided to stay for the ceremony. Although I knew Hannah would know nothing of dark root pack traditions, having her around would encourage me and make me see the bright side of this whole ordeal. I sighed and nodded reluctantly. Although having Hannah around was definitely a perk, it didn't change how I felt about this secret ceremony. Only the pack's alpha and beta knew what the ceremony held, so there was truly no way to find out what it consisted of. While I was lost in my own thoughts, Dean had gotten up from his desk and approached me. Standing directly in front of me, he reached out and cupped my chin with his hand, tilting my head up to face him. Don't worry about the ceremony, Audrey, he said, his voice calm but stern. Nothing bad is going to happen to you. I wouldn't allow it. A warming sensation in my chest overtook me once again. He wouldn't allow it? I wasn't completely sure if I trusted Dean yet, but something about his comment made me feel more at ease. He wanted to protect me, just as a mate should. But then again, what was Dean's definition of nothing bad? I had a feeling he and I may not see eye to eye on that. Before I had the chance to say anything, Dean leaned down and placed a firm kiss on my forehead. "Go meet Helen in our room so she can get you fitted," he said simply before taking my hand and helping me up from the chair. I obeyed Dean and headed back to our quarters without another word. When I arrived, Helen was ready with a tape measure and a white dress in hand. The dress fitting went without a hassle, and before I knew it, Helen was off with the dress and her measurements in hand. She assured me that she would have dinner ready and the dress properly sized within a couple of hours. As promised, after a couple of hours of me lying in the living room, drawing in my sketch pads, Helen arrived with both the dress and dinner in tow. Shortly after she arrived, Hannah also made an appearance. The three of us ate dinner and chatted, mostly to calm my nerves, before Helen left Hannah to get me ready for the ceremony. I showered thoroughly, just as Hannah had instructed, before reappearing in the bedroom, wrapped in a towel. Hannah quickly unzipped the dress bag and pulled out the dress, handing it to me before rummaging through my drawers to find my undergarments. Once I was dressed, I decided to check out my appearance in the closet mirror. The dress was long and white, so long that it dragged across the ground and featured lace detail around the chest and arms. It was stunning, to say the least, and its mere beauty calmed my nerves even more. Nothing terrible could happen in a dress as beautiful as this, right? As Hannah finished the final details on my hair and makeup, she smiled brightly at me. "You look gorgeous, Audrey. Your Luna ceremony probably won't be anything like mine was, but I have a feeling that it will be okay." I smiled back. Hannah's words of encouragement meant a lot to me. I knew she wouldn't lie. If Hannah had a bad feeling about this, she would have said so. Glancing over at the bedroom window, I noticed that it was now very dark outside. The day had gone by much faster than I'd expected it to, but at this point, I was ready to get it all over with. It was 1:45 in the morning, time for us to make our way outside to the stage that had been set up. Hannah led me downstairs, helping me with my long dress as we made our descent. She told me she would be able to stay with me until it was time for me to go onto the stage, but then she would have to take her seat with Rhett in the audience of our pack members. As we approached the front door of the pack house, Hannah squeezed my hand. "I have to leave you now." "It's time," she said softly with a small, encouraging smile. I nodded in understanding, but felt tears form in my eyes. "I meant it when I said I think everything will be okay," she told me. "But if you need me afterwards, I will be here." Without thinking, I leapt forward and pulled Hannah into a tight hug. I'd only known the young woman for a few days, but she had quickly become someone I cared about and appreciated. "Thank you," I whispered near her ear. Hannah pulled away and smiled at me, squeezing my hand once again before she turned around and disappeared out the front door. Hannah's presence was quickly replaced by one of Dean's personal guards, who looked familiar, but whose name I didn't know. "Luna, it's time," he said. "I will lead you onto the stage, and then the Alpha will lead things from there." I took a deep breath and nodded to the guard. He was polite enough, but not warm and friendly like Hannah. The guard took my arm before opening the door and leading me through. When I stepped out of the pack house, I found that I was standing on a platform stage rather than the usual grass that would have been under my feet. I felt my anxiety grow, yet again, as I anticipated what was about to happen. I looked to my right and saw Dean standing in front of a microphone. He was dressed in a black suit, and honestly, he looked incredibly handsome. The surrounding lights made his two different colored eyes sparkle, each one holding a different emotion. "Dark Root Pack, please welcome Audrey to the stage," Dean announced, his voice booming through the yard. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly approached Dean. He watched me carefully, his facial expression giving nothing away. With her presence, the Luna ceremony has commenced. Chapter 18 stretched his arm out towards me, offering me his hand. I reached out slowly, trying to keep my tremors under control, and grasped his hand. The sparks of our mate bond fired between us, causing my body to relax and my thoughts to quiet. I stood next to Dean and looked up at him, searching for some indication of what was about to happen. He then let go of my hand and gently grasped me by the shoulders, moving me so that I stood directly in front of him, looking out at our pack members. Audrey, Dean spoke again, his loud voice filling the air around us. Do you vow to serve this pack and your alpha with all of your heart, mind, and soul? I knew I had to speak, but I didn't want to. Not only was that a huge vow to make, but seeing all of my fellow pack members watching me so intently made my nerves go into overdrive. I do, I finally sputtered out. And do you vow to be an obedient Luna to both your pack and your alpha mate? It was odd hearing Dean refer to himself in the third person, but I knew it was all a part of the tradition of the ceremony. I do, I answered more quickly this time, attempting to make my voice project further. Do you accept me, Alpha Dean Whitaker, as both your chosen and assigned mate, by the power of the moon goddess? I couldn't help but think about how serious and powerful each of these statements was. Growing up as a native of Darkroot, I knew our people took vows, traditions, and rules very seriously. None of this was just for show, it was a sacred oath. I do. I noticed Dean give my shoulders a light squeeze, probably as an attempt at comfort or encouragement, before he continued, Very well. Audrey, do you accept your position and title as Luna of Darkroot Pack? I do, I said one final time, expecting that the ceremony was finally nearing its end. In reality, only a few minutes had passed, but to me, it felt like hours. With my final promise given, the pack broke out in claps for several seconds before quieting back down to silence. Darkroot Pack, I accept this woman, Audrey Allen, as my goddess-given and chosen mate. I accept and now initiate her as the Luna of Darkroot Pack. I couldn't help but smile a bit. It was official. I was my alpha's mate and the Luna of my own pack. I felt a sense of pride swell within me as my wolf pranced around with her head held high. But that feeling was short-lived. Before I could comprehend what was happening, I felt a burning hot pain in the side of my neck, causing me to lose my breath and my knees to buckle. I cried out as the pain shot through my body, leaving me unable to move or react in any other way. I then felt Dean's arms grab me around my waist, holding me up so that I didn't collapse to the ground. He had marked me. Without any warning at all and without asking, my mate had marked me in front of our entire pack. More claps and cheers began to fill the air as the pain in my neck slowly transformed into a comforting warmth. My muscles relaxed as exhaustion hit me, causing Dean to hold on to me even tighter. He then retracted his teeth from my neck and sealed the mark with a kiss. Chills, sparks, fireworks, all kinds of new sensations bombarded my entire body, making me want nothing more than to remain in my mate's arms. But that didn't change the fact that I was upset. I knew this ceremony was all about the pack tradition, but I hadn't expected it to go like this. I knew Dean would mark me at some point in our relationship, but I always imagined it happening differently. I pictured it happening when we were closer and under more intimate circumstances. My entire pack had just witnessed a very personal moment for me, one that I hadn't anticipated happening so soon, but much less with an audience. Tears slowly formed in my eyes, but I fought to keep them from spilling. I wouldn't cry in front of my pack. I couldn't. My head was pounding from the conflict inside. My wolf was ecstatic, completely over the moon. We were the Luna of our pack now, and our mate had publicly claimed us. She saw no wrong in that. She was proud. I, on the other hand, wanted to curl up with Dean and run far away from him at the same time. Our bond was now much stronger, and I could feel the physical connection that would allow us to mind link with one another. The strength of our bond made me want to love him and ravish him, but my normal, anxious nature, mixed with the fact that I was upset with him, made me want to go far away and hide. "Dark Root, meet your Luna, Audrey Whitaker," Dean announced loudly, causing his deep voice to boom around us once again. I forgot that I'd be taking his last name as well, but that was currently the least of my concerns. Panic built in my stomach as I began to worry about what else was expected of me tonight. Were Dean and I supposed to complete the mating process tonight? What exactly had I agreed to in those vows? Before there was enough time for the full-blown panic attack to set in, Dean did something else that took me completely by surprise. Before you all have a proper meet and greet with your Luna, there are some more serious matters that need to be taken care of, Dean told the pack. Drake Allen, you are under arrest for crimes committed against your Luna. Submit before our guards now. You will be taken to the dungeons while you await your trial. I froze. My entire body froze to the point that it felt as if my heart had stopped beating. The crowd was dead silent. All that could be heard was the hard footsteps of the guards searching the audience for my father. Dean was arresting my father. Finally able to react, I spun around and faced Dean with a look of sheer panic written across my face. Before I had the chance to speak, Dean grabbed me and pulled me against his chest, burying my face into him. "He won't hurt you ever again, Audrey," he said, only loud enough for me to hear. This time, the tears fell. It was too much. This was all too much. It was true that I had lived a miserable life before meeting Dean, and my father did deserve to answer for his actions, but this was Dark Root. The consequences of crimes were very serious, especially if the crime was against the Alpha or Luna. He was still my father. He may have shown me nothing but abuse and hatred after my mother passed away, but he was my father. Deep in my heart, I still loved him. I didn't want anything to happen to him. "Please don't hurt him," I whimpered to Dean, struggling to contain my sobs. This time, it was Dean who froze. He moved his arms to my shoulders and held me back from him a few inches so that he could look me in the eyes. I stared up at him with tears running down my face, and he simply stared back, looking confused. That was when I remembered the full effect of a mate's mark. Not only did it give you the ability to mind link with one another, but it also gave you the ability to share thoughts and emotions with one another. I had been projecting my emotions onto Dean without even realizing it. For the first time, he was catching a glimpse inside my mind. "Please stop crying," he said calmly. It was obvious that he was taken aback by the flood of emotions he had received from me, as he had probably never experienced such thoughts and emotions himself. I tried my hardest to close off my mind. I didn't know how all of the specifics of the mark worked, but I really tried. I didn't want Dean to be upset, too. The look he was giving me was full of more emotion than I thought would ever be possible to see on his face. "What he did to you is unacceptable, and he will pay the price for his actions," Dean told me, his voice now more serious as the effects of my emotions were beginning to wear off. With that statement, I knew Dean would not accept any counterargument, and quite frankly, I no longer had the energy. I allowed Dean to hold me against his chest as I looked out into the audience, just in time to see the guards leading my father back towards the pack house. He was staring straight at me, his facial features twisted into pure rage. He wasn't resisting the guards at all. He allowed them to lead him to the dungeons without a problem, but simply shot me a look of hatred the whole way. I buried my face back into Dean's chest, not wanting to see that look any longer. Sensing that something had happened, I felt Dean turn his head to look in the same direction. A deep growl erupted from Dean, letting me know that he, too, caught sight of the look my father was giving me, "Chain him with silver." I started trembling at Dean's words. I honestly didn't want them to hurt my father, but that didn't matter to Dean, apparently. I could feel the anger inside him as his breathing became heavier, and he clutched me tighter. Although being close to him was comforting in that moment, he was scaring me. I began to wiggle in his arms, trying to break free of his grip, but that only made him strengthen his grip. "A new time for you all to meet your Luna will be decided. Return to your quarters," Dean commanded the pack. The audience immediately dispersed, and lines formed to re-enter the pack house. I felt Dean's body was still tensed from anger, but he kept his composure for the time being. "Audrey, are you okay?" A familiar voice called from behind me. I immediately knew it was Hannah and tried to turn around to run to her, but Dean wouldn't let me budge. "Alpha Dean, let go of Audrey," Hannah said, her voice even but stern. Dean replied with nothing but a low growl directed at Hannah. He sounded incredibly frightening, which made me want to run away even more. "You're scaring her," Hannah growled back, this time not hesitating to raise her voice. I heard a set of footsteps run onto the stage and knew that Alpha Rhett must be coming to calm down his own mate. Although I appreciated Hannah's efforts, using such a tone with Dean wasn't a wise choice. At this point, Dean was holding onto me so tightly that I found it hard to breathe. "Please let go," I whimpered to him. Dean looked down at me, and I could see that both of his eyes were black, indicating that his wolf was close to surfacing. My father had really triggered him and his wolf, and Dean was slowly losing control. Without another word, Dean released me. I stumbled backwards a bit, but Hannah came up behind me just in time to steady me before I fell. Hannah wrapped her arms around me, knowing I needed comfort right then. What was going on? So many things had happened over the past hour that I couldn't even think straight. I was marked. My father was arrested. Now, my mate was nearly in a fit of rage. I watched as Dean approached the edge of the stage farthest from the pack house entrance and quickly shifted into his wolf form. Guards quickly scattered, not wanting to get in the way of their angry alpha. Dean was dangerous in his human form, but he was as lethal as a wolf. He was an incredibly large wolf featuring jet black fur and the same dazzling, heterochromatic eyes. In fact, if he hadn't looked downright terrifying at that moment, I probably would have even commented on how gorgeous his wolf was. "Come on, let's get you up to your room." "Give him a bit to calm down," Hannah told me, nudging me in the direction of the pack house door. I nodded and followed her lead, but paused before going back inside the pack house. I looked back in the direction Dean had gone and found that he was still sitting at the edge of the stage, watching me, his eyes lightly glowing in the darkness. As I turned back around and began to take a step inside, I paused just long enough to hear his wolf let out a long, sorrowful whine. Chapter 9. After Hannah walked me back upstairs, we talked for a few minutes before I assured her that I was okay and would prefer to be alone for a little while. Although once she left, I found myself wondering what to do. My mind was swirling with conflicting thoughts and emotions. My mate publicly claimed me and made me his Luna, which made me both happy and upset. He then arrested my father in front of the entire pack, which once again was both relieving and terrifying. What was I supposed to think? I hadn't a clue, but then again, I probably should have expected this. My mate was an alpha, after all. I couldn't help but wonder where Dean had gone after he shifted, or why he whined so sorrowfully as I entered the pack house. Part of me was tempted to seek the answer, but luckily, that part of me was still rather small compared to the normal, cowardly parts. Releasing a rather long sigh, I shook my head and walked to the living room window. It was still very dark outside, as sunrise wouldn't be for another few hours. I knew I should attempt to get some sleep, but I didn't know if that was even a possibility for me at the moment. I continued to stare out the window, seemingly at nothing, as the darkness seemed to go on forever. I could barely make out the tree line until something caught my eye. A light glow. I strained my eyes trying to find the source of the glow, but the darkness was too intense, especially in contrast to the light of the living room. Then it moved. As the glowing object moved closer to the pack house, I realized it was a pair of eyes, 2 different colored eyes. Dean's wolf. I froze and stared out the window at the wolf, only to realize he had been looking up at me the whole time. Was he trying to get my attention, or had he simply been watching me from afar? "Audrey," a deep voice within my head interrupted my thoughts, startling me at first. It took me a moment to realize the voice was Dean's, as I'd forgotten that his marking me provided us with a mind link. "Come to me," he requested as I continued to watch him. "You're angry," I replied timidly. Hearing my mate's voice in my head was a bit unsettling. "My wolf wants to spend time with you," he insisted as he stared up at me, cocking his head to the side. I sighed and began fidgeting with my thumbs nervously. I hadn't shifted in so long, and although my wolf was begging to be free, being around Dean in my wolf form brought about all kinds of new anxieties and complications for me. "I want to be with my mate," my wolf growled at me, finally forcing her way through the wall I'd put up the past few days. Taking a deep breath, I nodded. Once I was downstairs, I made my way outside to the main yard where Dean had been only minutes before. Now, however, he was nowhere to be seen. I wasn't sure what made me more uneasy, not knowing where Dean was or being outside alone in the middle of the night. Forcing myself to move forward, I slowly walked to the edge of the forest, making sure I paid attention to my surroundings. Besides Dean's sudden absence, nothing seemed too out of place. The forest was dark and quiet, other than the sound of insects chirping about in the night. Sliding behind a tree, I quickly stripped off my clothes, hung them over a tree branch, and shifted into my wolf form. I still wasn't comfortable with the thought of Dean seeing me naked, so I made sure to move as quickly as possible. As my bones began to shift around and snap into place, I felt my wolf come to the front of my mind. The darkness was now much brighter, the sounds around me were louder, and my sense of smell was heightened more than usual. Goddess, I had forgotten just how lovely it was to be in my wolf form. It had to have been a year since my last shift, and although that made this one a bit uncomfortable, I welcomed it. After shaking out our fur, my wolf sniffed our surroundings, desperate to be united with her mate for the first time. Catching a hint of his scent, she took off in the direction it came from. I sat at the back of our minds, allowing my wolf to have the freedom she deserved. The feeling of the grass under our paws, the wind in our fur, the stretching of unused muscles, it all felt glorious. Just when we finally felt that we were on his trail, a large force came through the trees and slammed into us, knocking us onto our backs. My wolf grunted and sneezed as she forced herself to regain composure. She rolled over onto her side and looked up to see Dean's wolf standing in front of us, staring down with his tongue out and tail swaying. He wanted to play? Wasting no time, my wolf jumped back up and launched our body at Dean, hoping to pounce on him just as he had done to us. As an alpha, Dean's reflexes were incredibly fast, and he managed to dodge us, causing us to land face first on the forest floor. My wolf huffed and shook out our chocolate brown fur as she stood up once again. "Mate," I heard through our mind link. The voice was very obviously Dean's, but there was a certain feral gruffness to it that told me his wolf was now at the front of his mind as well. My wolf swayed our tail in a rather flirtatious manner before circling Dean's wolf, taking in every part and angle of his body. He towered over us, but that didn't intimidate my wolf at all. She appreciated his large stature and well-built muscles, and Dean's wolf seemed to appreciate her admiring his body. I, on the other hand, was blushing internally at my wolf's bold behavior. Dean's wolf then stepped forward, forcing my wolf's inspection to come to a halt. He stared down at us for a moment with his blue and brown eyes before leaning forward and nuzzling us. He then nudged us, insisting that we lie down. My wolf complied and watched Dean's wolf intently as he began to circle us, sniffing and licking every inch of our body, rubbing his scent on every place he could get it. My wolf was basking in the intimate attention we were receiving from our mate, but I didn't know what to think about the situation. My instincts screamed yes, but my anxiety screamed no. Dean's wolf finally stopped, finally satisfied with his work, and then out of nowhere, he sprinted off deeper into the woods. My wolf forced us to our feet in a matter of seconds and took off after him. Unfortunately, due to our small stature and overall lack of strength, we were no match for Dean's speed. Sensing that we were far behind, Dean's wolf turned and circled back around so that he was running just slightly behind us, nipping at our tail playfully. After running together for several more minutes, we suddenly found ourselves knocked to the ground once again, and this time, Dean's wolf had him pinned. He stared down at us for a moment before leaning down to lick at our snout. "You need sleep," Dean's voice cut into my mind, this time sounding much more like himself and less like his wolf. My wolf whined at the comment, not wanting her freedom or time with her mate to end. Dean's wolf nuzzled her affectionately, silently assuring her that they would have their moment again. As soon as Dean's wolf moved aside, I urged my wolf to go find our clothes so that I could shift back modestly. She didn't have a problem with our mate seeing me nude, but I was not having such a thing. It didn't take her long to find the tree with my clothing laid upon it, and once we did, I began to focus on shifting back. My wolf whined at me, still upset that her freedom was coming to an end for the night. I simply scoffed at her and focused on regaining my control. Once I was back on my own 2 feet, I wasted no time getting dressed. I couldn't risk Dean coming to find me, only to see me completely naked. My wolf may have been okay with it, but I knew that although our relationship seemed to have improved, it still wasn't to that level yet. Fully clothed and ready to go, I wandered back through the woods in search of Dean. I didn't think he'd leave me out here alone. Although Dean went about it in an odd way, I could tell he was protective of me. It made me happy, but it was a lot to deal with at the same time. I wasn't used to having anyone care about my well-being. "Dean," I called out as I couldn't see him anywhere nearby. As if on command, a very shirtless Dean stepped out from behind a nearby tree. Looking for me, he asked with his eyebrow raised and a rather sly look on his face. I simply nodded in reply, as the sight of his shirtless, muscular body decorated in tattoos was making me blush furiously. "Let's get you to bed," Dean added more seriously this time. He held out his hand for me, and I assumed he wanted to take it, but being me, I stared down at his wide-open palm for several seconds before placing my small hand in his large one. Dean held my hand tightly as he led me back to the pack house. It was almost as if he was afraid I'd slip away, or someone would take me from him at any moment. I couldn't deny that I felt safe with him. Even if everything else wasn't even close to being perfect yet, I knew I could count on him to protect me. Upon entering the pack house, we were greeted with nothing but utter silence. I'd never been awake at such an hour before, much less roaming the pack house. Despite the Luna ceremony being only a couple of hours ago, everyone was now tucked away in their personal quarters. Just as we started to make our ascent upstairs, a deep voice caused both of us to freeze. "Well, son, she's prettier than I imagined." I turned around to see who had spoken to us, only for Dean to pull me tightly against his chest. "What are you doing here, father?" Dean growled. "Father? Archibald Whitaker?" He chuckled darkly. "I live here, in case you've forgotten, son." "I told you to stay away from her," Dean snapped. "What a shame. I can't even be introduced to my daughter-in-law? My Pax Luna? I thought I'd raised you better than that," Archibald scoffed. "Look at me, child," Archibald added. I couldn't help but be taken aback by his little name for me. I may be many things, but I was not a child. I squirmed in Dean's arms until I was able to look over my shoulder. There, directly behind us, stood a man who appeared to be a much older version of Dean. They shared the same skin tone and dark hair, but Archibald's hair was streaked with silver and gray. You are quite a pretty thing." "Although I did expect much more for my son and my pack," Archibald said, his tone laced with a hint of disappointment. Dean growled in response, "Don't you dare insult my mate." "But you know what really intrigues me, son?" Archibald questioned, completely disregarding Dean's threat. "How does a she-wolf who looks so weak have this aura of power surrounding her? Becoming a Luna doesn't make weak she-wolf strong." "Quite interesting." My mind was spinning. I'd been complimented, insulted, and questioned all in a matter of minutes by my mate's own father, my former alpha. I didn't understand anything he was saying. All I knew was that I wanted to be far away from him. Be gone. Dean growled, this time with much more power. If you come near her again, I'll make sure you find your place in the dungeons, where you belong. Chapter 10. Once Dean had asserted himself to his father, we continued upstairs and headed straight to bed, knowing we wouldn't get as much sleep as we desired. It was already nearly dawn, and Dean usually had to be up fairly early to start his day of alpha duties. It didn't take either of us long to fall asleep. The events of the night had worn both of us out and made the large, plush bed more welcoming than ever. The next morning, when I awoke, I was surprised to see that not only was Dean still fast asleep in bed with me, but the nearby clock read 10 o'clock in the morning. Dean was usually off to his office by 7. I didn't take him for the type to catch up on missed sleep, but I had curtly guessed wrong. Deciding to get our day off to a nice start, I slowly slid out of bed, careful not to disturb Dean, and tiptoed to the kitchen. Perhaps he would like a small breakfast to eat before going to the office or even to take with him. I smiled to myself at the thought of making my mate happy for once, although I knew he wasn't one to show much emotion. In the kitchen, I dug out the appropriate pans and fried up a few eggs while a bagel was toasting. A simple breakfast sandwich should suffice, especially if he decides to take it to the office with him rather than eating here. I sprinkled some cheese over the top of the eggs and allowed it to melt while I popped the bagel out of the toaster and lightly spread cream cheese on one half and a touch of honey mustard on the other. Once I was satisfied with the meltiness of the cheese, I put the sandwich together and placed it on a paper plate before setting it on the end of the counter. Like clockwork, I heard Dean slide out of bed and walk around the room. Through our mind link, I could feel he was slightly panicked, likely wondering where I was. This was the first time I had woken before him. Feeling the urge to calm my mate, I walked back to the bedroom and watched him from the doorway as he hurried to pull a dress shirt over his head. Once his head popped through the head hole, he saw me standing at the other end of the room, watching him, and I noticed he visibly relaxed. "Where did you go?" he immediately questioned, staring me down with a serious expression. "I made you breakfast," I replied simply and softly, feeling a bit anxious due to the look on Dean's face mixed with the tone of his voice. Dean paused for a moment, almost as if he was shocked by my words. "Oh, thank you." I nodded as Dean walked towards the bedroom door and then out to the kitchen, quickly turning to follow behind him. Once he reached the kitchen counter, he grabbed the plate and took a bite of the sandwich, looking as if he was seriously thinking things over while chewing. "It's very good, but I'll need to take it with me to the office." "Thank you again, Audrey," he told me with a faint smile. I nodded again and smiled back, thoroughly enjoying the feeling of pleasing my mate and having a somewhat normal morning with him for once. If I could keep my head straight, perhaps things would continue to move in the right direction. I just needed to try and trust him, like Hannah told me. Dean set the plate back down and quickly moved towards me, reaching out to cup my face with his hands. "You're even more beautiful when you smile. I'd like to see it more often." He pressed a warm kiss to my cheek, right near the corner of my lips, and hesitated for a moment before pulling away. His hesitation made me wonder what was going through his mind, but I couldn't focus on that thought for long as an intense blush formed on my cheeks. Dean grabbed the plate with his breakfast again and headed towards the front door of our quarters so he could tend to his alpha duties that had already been delayed by several hours. "Oh, and Audrey? Please meet me in my office once you've eaten and cleaned up." My eyes widened a bit. What could he possibly need me in his office for that we couldn't discuss right now? Before I could work up the courage to ask, Dean had walked out the door, closing it firmly behind him. I sighed as I felt my anxiety growing like a weed in my stomach, a deeply rooted nuisance. Surely whatever Dean needed me in his office for wouldn't be bad. We had already completed the Luna ceremony. What could be worse than that? I went through my morning routine, which included showering and completing all the other daily essentials before applying makeup and drying my hair. Once my hair was tamed with a brush and a few styling products, I decided it looked presentable in its natural state. I then took a deep breath and made the short journey over to Dean's office. Although I was anxious about what he might say, I knew I couldn't put it off much longer. Surely if it were of extreme importance, he would have told me this morning. Sooner than I expected, I found myself outside the massive oak door that led into Dean's office. Taking one more deep breath, I gently tapped my knuckles against the hardwood. "Come in," Dean's deep voice echoed from the other side of the door. Refusing to waste any more time, I quickly turned the doorknob and pushed the door open, immediately making eye contact with my mate. "That was fast. Did you eat?" Dean asked, raising an eyebrow at me as I stepped inside his office and shut the door behind me. I froze at his question, suddenly realizing that I did, in fact, forget to eat breakfast. I knew Dean wouldn't be happy, but he'd probably be downright angry if I lied. I slowly shook my head as I looked down at my feet, preparing myself for Dean's criticism. Dean let out a gruff sigh, but refrained from lecturing me on the importance of eating. I knew I was considered unhealthy and that I needed to gain weight, but it was hard to get into the habit of eating regularly. "Have a seat," Dean told me, nodding towards the chair on the other side of his desk. I immediately complied, eager to shift the focus away from my eating habits. "Now that you're almost officially the Pax Luna, I thought it'd be a good time to instruct you on some of the duties you'll have," Dean told me. I stared at him for a moment, cocking an eyebrow almost. Dean stared back, as if he genuinely didn't understand my question. "You've been marked and initiated, but we haven't made it," he simply stated. My face instantly heated up at his words. Of course, I knew that the mate bond wasn't complete until the pair had mated, but I hadn't expected it to have anything to do with my position as the Pax Luna. Now, I was worried that Dean would be more determined to complete the mating process. Pack members could smell us and know that we hadn't finished our mate bond, and that would look bad on both of us. I think you already understand the importance of that matter, but regardless, you can be informed of your duties as the Luna, even if you can't participate yet, Dean told me. I was just thankful that he changed the subject. "Of course," I murmured quickly with a small nod. "The majority of your work will be done in the infirmary and school. You can help out in those locations in any area that you'd like or that is needed. We've also traditionally had a day once a month where the Luna helps prepare and serve breakfast for the pack. You may also help me with paperwork if I request it," Dean explained. I nodded again. Those duties seemed pretty simple and like tasks I could handle. Before speaking another word, Dean stood from his desk and walked towards me. This seemed to be a common occurrence between us, but it always shocked me. He stood in front of me in all of his tall, muscular glory and stared down at me before cupping my chin with one hand and tilting my head up to face him. "But we do need to complete our mate bond soon, Audrey. It's not right for things to be like this. I know you're not ready, but you need to understand the importance," Dean explained. There it was. There's the lecture. I didn't know how to respond, so Dean and I continued to stare into each other's eyes. Dean moved in closer, hovering just inches away from my lips. "Do you understand the importance, Audrey?" I swallowed hard as I stared back into his two different colored eyes. I understood, of course, but that didn't make things any better on my end of the deal. Slowly, I nodded in response. "Good, because this needs to happen sooner rather than later. It's important to our mate bond and our pack." My whole body went rigid at Dean's words. Was he insinuating that the completion of our mate bond needed to take place tonight? Before I could ask any more questions, Dean leaned in closer. So close that we were only millimeters away. So close that in one quick movement, he planted his lips against mine. Chapter 11. After mine and Dean's very sudden kiss, I found myself very confused. I had, of course, frozen during a moment that was supposed to be very special to me. My first kiss with my mate. At first, I had attempted to kiss him back, and although Dean still seemed very into it, I panicked and pulled away. Dean let out a heavy sigh, but didn't comment on my actions. Just remember the importance of all of this, he reminded me before returning to the chair he had placed behind his desk. I nodded and stood from my chair, walking across his office to the door. Part of me felt guilty. Why do I always seem to mess things up? This could have been a really great moment between Dean and me, but I'd gone and made it all awkward. Typical. At this point, I had no idea what to do with the rest of my day. Dean hadn't given any further instructions, and there was nothing on my mind that seemed desirable. Honestly, I wouldn't mind spending a whole day with my mate and attempting to get to know him, but he was far too busy for that. He was an alpha. What else could I expect? Audrey, what do you plan to do with the rest of your day? Dean asked, just as I was about to leave the room. I paused before turning my head to face him again. I don't really know. My answer was truthful. I had no clue what to do with my day. In all honesty, my only plan so far was to return to our quarters and work on my drawing, but I knew that would grow boring after a couple of hours. I felt rather useless, being the Pax Luna, but being unable to carry out any of my responsibilities. Perhaps you should go mingle with the pack in the dining hall and other common areas, since the meet and greet didn't go as planned last night, Dean suggested. I smiled at Dean's suggestion and nodded, although the idea twisted in my stomach, making me feel nervous. As one might expect, I was no good at socializing. As I finally stepped out of the office and shut the door behind me, I felt even more lost about what to do. Who should I mingle with? What should I say? Where should I go? Maybe I should just go back to our quarters. Would Dean even find out? Despite my anxiety, I knew disobeying Dean was not the best way to go. Taking a deep breath, I took a step forward and made my way downstairs to the common areas of the pack house. The first floor was the center of all social life for the pack. There was a theater, multiple meeting rooms, the dining hall and kitchen, a library, and a number of other places for pack members to relax and enjoy hobbies or company. Once I reached the main level, I decided that the dining hall would be a good place to start. By now, it was early afternoon. There wouldn't be a large crowd of people, but those who enjoyed an early lunch may be around. As I entered the large room full of long, dark oak tables, I was taken back to not all that long ago when I first met Dean as his server at the ball. I smiled to myself at the thought. It all seemed so crazy now. How did a girl like me go from an abusive father and working with Omegas to being mated to her Pax Alpha? I stared at the few groups of people who remained in the dining hall and worked up the confidence to go introduce myself to each group. The first group I approached was a group of elderly ladies who appeared to be having a cup of tea and biscuits. They seemed friendly, and I figured being friendly was the best way to start. "Hello, ladies," I said, forcing my voice to be bold as I approached the small group. They turned their attention to me and stared, obviously not immediately recognizing me from last night's ceremony. "I'm your Luna, Audrey. I was out mingling with the pack today and thought I'd stop to say hello," I told them. The elderly ladies suddenly began to squeal from excitement, sounding like a bunch of schoolgirls. One of the three clapped her hands together several times while another pulled out a chair and insisted I sit down with them. "Oh, our Luna. What an honor." "Oh, such a precious young girl," they complimented endlessly, squeezing my hand and patting me gently on the shoulder. Although I was blushing profusely, perhaps this whole socialization ordeal wouldn't be so bad after all. "You and Alpha Dean are so lucky to have each other, and what a beautiful pair you make," one of the ladies, who wore a pink hat and long, silky gloves, told me. I smiled brightly at her. I truly appreciated all of their kind comments, and since I had no grandparents of my own, socializing with these ladies was actually quite heartwarming. "Yes, yes, yes," one of the other ladies, this one wearing a large, sparkly butterfly brooch, exclaimed. "She's just the sweetest little thing, isn't she? It's truly an honor, Luna. I know our Alpha needs a young lady like yourself." After a few more minutes of chatting with the ladies, I decided it was time to excuse myself and move on to the next group. I could only hope that the rest of the pack would be as welcoming as they had been. The other group of individuals nearest to me in the dining hall consisted of several girls who appeared to be around the same age as me. I didn't recognize them, so I assumed they wouldn't recognize me from my previous life working alongside the Omegas. "Hello," I chirped as I slowly approached them, granting them a bright smile. "I'm your Luna, Audrey. I'm out and about, meeting some of my pack members today. I just thought I'd stop by and say hello," I told them, my smile never fading. I'd been hoping for a warm welcome like I'd received from the group of elderly ladies, but what I got was much more disappointing. "Oh look, it's the Alpha's new mate," one of the girls, a petite blonde, said with a laugh. She was attempting to keep her voice low, but I'd heard every word. "Please, come, sit with us," another girl with much darker hair said to me as if she thought I hadn't heard the comments from her friend. At this point, I was tense. Did the second girl seriously think I hadn't heard her rude little friend? I was appalled, quite frankly, but didn't know how to act on my emotions. They'd barely spoken a few sentences to me, and I felt like crying. "So, how did Alpha Dean get matched with a girl like you?" a third girl asked, seeming amused by the entire situation. The girl with dark hair who'd asked me to sit with them looked offended by her friend's words, but I didn't buy it. "Jessica, hush," she hissed as if that would make the entire situation better. "What? I just don't understand it, is all. She used to work with the Omegas, Claire. And now she's our Alpha's mate? As if." Before they could say anything more, I turned around and sprinted out the door of the dining hall. As soon as I came to the foot of the stairs, I rushed up them, surely startling anyone who may have seen me. I had to get away from those girls and their hurtful words. It was hard enough for me to think such things about myself. I didn't need complete strangers to have the same thoughts. By the time I reached the floor where mine and Dean's quarters were located, I was sobbing. Why had they said those things in front of me? I hadn't done a thing to them. I was only trying to be nice. It hurt. I busted through the doors of our quarters, completely ignoring the guards standing outside. They didn't question my tears or my frantic behavior, thankfully. Much to my surprise, once I came through the front door, I ran straight into Dean's solid chest. It took Dean only a matter of seconds to realize something was wrong. Perhaps it was the fact that I was running and entering our home in such a distressed state, or maybe he could hear my sobs or glance at my tears. I didn't know, but he knew. "Audrey, what's the matter?" Dean demanded. His voice was stern but laced with worry. "Nothing. I shouldn't even be here." I cried, making no sense to myself and likely even less sense to Dean. Before I could run away, Dean grabbed me by my shoulders and placed me in front of him. "What happened?" he asked, his voice low but filled with concern. "I don't ever know who they were." I blurted out. "One said Jessica, one said Claire, I don't know. I was just trying to be nice." I sounded pathetic, even to myself, but I couldn't help it. Everything they'd said was true. I wasn't good enough, Dean. Why was he with me? Was he trying to make a statement? He deserved a better Luna. Someone strong. Dean stared at me for a moment, holding me by the shoulders the entire time. "Some girls made you cry, just for speaking with them?" Dean questioned. I just knew he was going to turn on me at any moment. Of course, I was being irrational. I was stupid for getting so upset over something so small. Something that didn't even matter. I slowly nodded as I reached up and wiped the tears from my eyes. "Well, Audrey," he started, releasing me from his grasp for the first time since I'd come home to our quarters. "You're going to help me find them, and they're going to regret their words." My heart began pounding even harder at Dean's words. Regret? Coming from the alpha of the Dark Root Pack, that surely wasn't good. "No, Dean. It'll be okay. I'll be okay," I attempted to assure him, forcing the tears to stop spilling out of my eyes. "Do you not understand, Audrey?" he yelled, turning back around to face me. "They've insulted my mate. They've hurt my mate. They've disrespected their own Luna. Offenses like that are not taken lightly. They will face consequences. Chapter 12. There was no room for argument. Dean grabbed my arm and pulled me out of our quarters, despite me looking a mess with tears streaking down my cheeks and pieces of hair stuck to my face. He was serious. We were really going to find the girls right now. I honestly worried for those girls. I didn't like them at all. They were cruel, but I had a feeling that whatever Dean had planned was far more intense than they could ever imagine. Can't we just go home and pretend this didn't happen? I blubbered out as Dean hastily led me down the staircase. They will answer for their actions, Audrey. Dean growled loudly, not caring who was nearby. I don't even know where they'd be. I whimpered. I'm the alpha of this pack. I'll have no problem finding out. I swallowed hard. Dean was determined. He was seeing red, and there was nothing I could do about it. I wanted to believe that these bratty girls deserved whatever was coming for them, but I just couldn't force myself to. Dean had already shown me once before that he didn't take disrespect lightly. He chained my father with silver just for looking at me the wrong way. Once we made it down to the main level, Dean began to pull aside any pack member he encountered, questioning them about knowing any young girls named Claire or Jessica. I wanted to mention that there were 3 of them and that one of them hadn't even been all that terrible, but I knew it wouldn't matter at this point. Several pack members later, Dean was sure he had the answers to who the girls were, and I would be the one to identify them. His grip on my wrist remained steady as he pulled me back upstairs to the 2nd floor, where the personal quarters for pack members resided. Once we got up the stairs, Dean pulled me down the hallway to our right and began scanning the room numbers as we passed by. Once he was satisfied that we'd come to the first girl's home, he brought us to a halt before pounding on the door. It wasn't the knock of a welcome visitor by any means. The sound of Dean's fist pounding on the wood of the door meant serious business, and it was likely that the residents inside already knew something was wrong before they knew who was at the door. The door slowly opened, revealing a middle-aged couple who appeared to be a fairly average family for the dark root pack. They shared dark brown hair and amber-toned hazel eyes, which were now filled with worry. Alpha, the man spoke, stepping in front of his mate and trying to suppress the stutter that his nervousness brought. And Luna, he quickly added, bowing his head slightly. To what do we owe the pleasure? The man asked, trying to make the situation seem like an honor, despite the fact that he knew that this visit wouldn't bring good news. The alpha of Darkroot didn't make house calls. In fact, I'd be willing to bet that Dean had rarely ever set foot on the 2nd floor. We need to speak with your daughter, Claire, Dean stated sternly. The man's eyes widened, and his mate's grip on his arm seemed to tighten. Yes, Alpha, certainly, he replied, not daring to question his alpha. Claire. The woman yelled, calling her daughter to come to the door. I didn't miss the shakiness in her voice. What mother? The young woman asked, sounding annoyed as she rounded the corner out of the hallway and approached her parents. When her eyes landed on Dean, she froze and fell to her knees, bowing her head in submission. Nothing needed to be said. She already knew. Once I saw her dark hair and eyes, I immediately recognized her from our encounter earlier. She was the one girl out of the 3 who hadn't been cruel to me. Goddess knows what she could have been thinking and keeping to herself, but she didn't voice any negative, inappropriate opinions, and that was what was important. She had at least attempted to make me feel welcome. A low growl began to build in the back of Dean's throat, causing me to reach out and gently lay my hand on his forearm. Dean, not her, I said softly. His gaze shot down to meet mine, looking both confused and angry. She was a part of the group, but she didn't say anything cruel. She tried to be nice, I told him honestly. This girl didn't deserve to suffer for her friend's actions. Dean still seemed tense, but he accepted my answer with a sharp nod. Stand, he commanded the girl. She complied without hesitation. It was nearly impossible for one to resist their alpha's command. You will gather your 2 friends and meet us outside in the courtyard. If you do as I say, you will receive no punishment, Dean told her, his voice still sounding heated. Yes, Alpha, she replied with a nod. Dean moved out of the way of her doorway, pulling me alongside him as the girl quickly exited her family's apartment. Her parents remained in the same place, staring at us with expressions of horror. You could tell they didn't have a clue what was going on and that they wanted to ask, but they didn't. They knew better than to demand information from their Alpha. Your daughter will not be harmed, Dean told the couple before turning back down the hallway and making his way towards the staircase, still clutching me tightly. It was a bit of a struggle to keep up with his long strides, especially since he was holding onto my wrist. I tried hard not to stumble over my own feet, and several times I felt as if I was practically being dragged. I may not have been good at handling my emotions, but it seemed that Dean wasn't either. By the time we got downstairs and went outside to the courtyard, most of our pack members were out of sight. It was nearing late evening, so everyone was either getting dinner or heading back to their personal quarters for the night. Dean led me over to one of the many benches situated out front for ceremonies and pack meetings, such as my Luna ceremony. We sat down and stared ahead, although there was nothing before us other than our massive pack house. I was tense, and I knew Dean could sense it. He could likely feel it from his grip on my wrist and through our mate bond that had intensified from him marking me. I hadn't a clue what he had in mind for those girls, and I was honestly scared for them. They were clearly not good people, but did they deserve Dean's anger? Relax, Dean said, although his voice was not calming in the least. I could still hear the anger flowing through his words, and his body was rigid as he fought to keep his wolf at bay. My wolf was flattered that our mate was so insulted by these girls' comments towards us, but I, on the other hand, couldn't fathom why Dean was so intensely upset. I simply decided not to respond. A few moments later, I heard the front door of the pack house open, and my head snapped in the direction of the noise. Slowly, Claire stepped outside with her two friends in tow. When the other two girls saw Dean and me, their eyes widened. Claire clearly hadn't told them the truth about where she was taking them, but could anyone really blame her? Come, Dean commanded, yelling across the courtyard at the girls. He spoke to them as if they were being summoned for their punishment. And I guess, in a way, they were. The girls quickly complied and scurried over to stand before Dean and me, their eyes cast down the entire time. Claire seemed slightly more at ease, but the tension in her body was still noticeable. State your names. I am Jessica. Jessica Finnegan, Alpha, the blonde girl answered first. I definitely recognized her from earlier, both her name and her face. And my name is Analea Highsmith, Alpha. The other girl spoke, her light brown hair falling forward to hide her face. Do the two of you know why you're here? Dean questioned, finally standing from the bench and pulling me up with him. And no, Alpha, Analea responded quietly. No, Alpha. We don't know why you've summoned us, Jessica clarified, her voice a bit bolder. I assumed she figured that her confidence would gain her the Alpha's respect. She just thought it wrong. You've both committed serious offenses against your own pack, Dean growled at the girls, causing me to grip his arm with my free hand. No matter what punishment he may have planned, I didn't want him to lose control. The two of you insulted your own Luna. You insulted her and made her feel unwelcome in her own pack. Do either of you think that's acceptable? Dean continued to speak sternly. I squeezed his arm again, desperate to keep him thinking rationally. If he allowed his wolf to surface, there was no telling what could happen. I was scared standing next to him as his mate, his Luna. I couldn't even begin to imagine how the girls before us felt. The girls flinched at their Alpha's words, looking further and further down with every syllable he spoke. No, Alpha. It is not acceptable. We're very sorry for our behavior. We apologize, Luna. Analea peeked up at me through her bangs as she spoke, and I saw nothing but fear in her wide, brown eyes. Do you two agree that you deserve to be punished for your actions? Dean asked. He was now speaking loudly rather than yelling, and his body seemed to have finally relaxed a bit from my touch. "Alpha, they said they were sorry," Claire pleaded, obviously still fearing for her friend's well-being. "Those are just words." Dean growled again, his frustration evident. "I advise you to leave now, before I change my mind about sparing you." Claire quickly bowed her head to both of us before taking off in the direction of the pack house doors. Jessica and Analia looked up briefly to watch their friend run away, with expressions of betrayal slapped across their faces. They'd obviously expected Claire to either continue standing up for them or to suffer alongside them. "I think a public reprimand is in order," Dean said. "We'll schedule it for first thing tomorrow afternoon." I gasped and looked over at Dean, horror written all over my face. He couldn't be serious. Surely, he wasn't serious. He was just trying to scare them, right? "Alpha, please." Jessica suddenly broke into sobs and dropped to her knees, bowing at our feet and begging for mercy. Analia quickly followed her lead, her body trembling with fright. "Dean," I whispered, hoping I could grab his attention and somehow talk him out of this. We hadn't had a public reprimand in several years. It was one of the most humiliating, demeaning, and painful punishments that the Alpha could issue to anyone. These girls may have hurt my feelings, but I didn't think they deserved such extreme measures. Dean ignored me and continued staring down at the girls as they begged and pleaded at our feet. I wanted to pardon them, to spare them, to forgive them, but I couldn't. I didn't have the authority. Even if I did grab Dean's attention and convince him to listen to me, I likely wouldn't get anywhere. Analia and Jessica continued to cry, the sounds of their sobs growing louder by the minute as they imagined their punishment to come. I cringed at the sound of their cries. It wasn't easy for me to cope with the thought of young girls being hurt either. Not after the childhood I'd endured. I took a deep breath and slowly let it out, attempting to calm myself before I, too, broke out into tears. "Return to your quarters and enjoy the last normal night you'll have for a long time," Dean ordered. Chapter 13 sleep didn't come easily to me that night. At some point, I ended up dozing off, but not until I'd tossed and turned for hours. Dean seemed perfectly relaxed and drifted off long before me. Not only did I find it a miracle that my excessive movement didn't wake him, but I didn't understand how he could sleep so peacefully, knowing the punishment he'd sentenced those girls to. It was moments like these that made me question the moon goddess's decision. How could someone like Dean truly be my perfect match? My other half? I would never deny that I cared for him. He was my mate, after all, but I felt like every time we made progress, something came up to put us back at square one. Would I even be able to look him in the eye after tomorrow? When it was time for me to get up and get ready for my day, I realized very quickly that I'd only gotten a couple of hours of sleep. I'd slept on less before and would be fine, but my body had slowly become accustomed to the luxurious bed, the comfort of our mattress, and the soothing sleep that followed. But it was hard to be soothed by your mate's presence, knowing he would be publicly reprimanding young girls the next day. Dean had already left our wing, of course. I'd woken up around my normal time despite my lack of sleep, and Dean had already gone to his office for the day to take care of whatever necessities before the public reprimand. Did one dress up for these occasions? Although I was dreading it, something told me Dean would expect me to look classy and put together, like a faithful Luna. I may not agree with this whole ordeal, but I didn't want to upset him, and I certainly didn't want to appear before my pack looking messy and unprofessional. With a long sigh, I finally slid out of bed and walked over to the closet to pick out something to wear. Most of the clothing the maids had gotten for me was neutral colors, which was fine by me, but I felt the need to dress in dark colors for the occasion. Professional, but dark. Behind several pairs of pants, I found a black pencil skirt tucked away and plucked it from its hanger before beginning to rummage through the blouses. Most of my tops were lighter in color and didn't really match the vibe I was going for with this outfit. As I continued to slide through the hangers, I grew frustrated. Was there not one black shirt in this closet? Just as I was about to give up and come up with some excuse as to why I couldn't attend this so-called event, I spotted it. At the very back of the closet hung a single black blouse. It was a long-sleeved button-up made of a silk-like material, and it was perfect. Feeling satisfied with my funeral-like clothing, I got dressed and then went to the bathroom to finish getting ready. Although I knew there was a high chance of my crying at some point during the day, I decided makeup was necessary. I needed to show that I could be a proper Luna, even if there were a risk of my falling apart in front of my pack. After staring at myself in the mirror for several minutes, I decided I was satisfied with my appearance, or as satisfied as one could be, knowing they were about to witness a very difficult, disturbing scene unfold. It was time to meet Dean in his office. As I started to make the short walk that I'd become quite familiar with, I noticed my anxiety grew faster than usual. I was only a few steps out into the hallway, and my hands were already trembling. My heart hadn't begun pounding just yet, but I knew that familiar feeling would follow close behind. My legs grew numb the closer I got to Dean's office, almost as if they didn't want to continue this journey. My mind and body were fighting against this. Every instinct within me knew it was wrong, but there was nothing I could do to stop it. I was helpless, as usual. With another deep breath, I reached out and knocked on the office door, not bothering to wait for a response before turning the knob and pushing it open. Inside, Dean was standing in the center of the room wearing a white button-up shirt and dark gray dress slacks. Today, he was also sporting a dark blue tie, which, I had to admit, made him look even more handsome, and it appeared he was straightening it out as I entered the room. How could a man so handsome be so intense on the inside? "Audrey, right on time," Dean said, acknowledging me with a nod. He acted so casually as if we were about to attend a meeting or a luncheon. I nodded in response. I didn't know what to say to him, and the event hadn't even taken place yet. Slowly, Dean approached me and casually wrapped an arm around my waist once he was within proper distance. He then leaned down and pressed a warm kiss to my temple. His touch and the fullness of his lips pressed to my skin made me want to curl my body against his. With one little touch, our mate bond had me melting, and for one brief moment, I almost forgot the difficult events that were about to take place. Hand in hand, Dean and I exited his office and made our way downstairs and out front to the courtyard. By now, the entire pack had been notified of the reprimand, and a large portion of the pack was already seated outside, eager to get good seats. As intense as it may seem, that was just how the majority of Dark Root Pack members were. Traditionally, we adhered to strict rules and harsh consequences, and as a result, most pack members avoided getting into trouble. More likely, these girls had not expected Dean to find out about their misconduct, or they thought he would have agreed with them. Dean and I took to the podium as I tried to casually wipe my free hand on the edge of my skirt, desperate to stop the perspiration. It was useless, however, as my anxiety was growing exponentially by the second. "Welcome, Dark Root Pack," Dean spoke loudly, his deep voice echoing off the pack house and surrounding buildings. "Today, we come together to be reminded that there are consequences for every action. Today, I hope each of you are reminded of what happens to those who are not loyal to their Alpha and Luna and who disobey pack rules." As he finished speaking, a couple of guards shoved open the front door of the pack house and proceeded to drag Analia and Jessica towards the stage area. Traditionally, the Alpha would carry out the reprimand himself, and just the thought of witnessing my mate do such a thing broke my heart in half. Once the guards got close enough, they pushed Analia and Jessica onto the stage, only about a foot away from mine and Dean's feet. The girls were crying, and their overall appearance suggested that they hadn't slept well the night before. Could anyone really blame them? As hurt as I was by their behavior and words, this consequence would hurt a lot more. In fact, many people were never quite the same after experiencing a public reprimand, and many pack members never looked at them the same again, either. Analia Highsmith and Jessica Finnegan, Dean started, his voice still booming and silencing the crowd even further. You two have been sentenced to a public reprimand. You will each receive 5 lashings with a silver-coated whip. Do you understand? Analia had begun sobbing by the end of Dean's piece, but was attempting to nod in response. Jessica, however, was trying to keep herself together, despite the tears streaking down her cheeks. Why yes, Alpha, Jessica finally replied with a stutter. Dean nodded and then turned to the pack members seated in the audience. As some of you may already know, these 2 young women directly insulted our Luna. Disrespect towards your pack, your Alpha, and your Luna will not be tolerated under any circumstances. There were a few murmurs among the crowd, likely from people expressing their disgust with the girls on stage. In a way, that disturbed me too. This was something that could have happened to anyone. In fact, it was very likely that many pack members felt the same way as these girls did about Dean and me being mates. Is the pack in agreement that this behavior is unacceptable? Dean asked as he let go of my hand and stepped forward to take the whip from one of the guards. Yes, Alpha, the pack shouted in unison. Without any further words, Dean turned to Jessica. Prepare, he commanded. I cringed at both his words and his tone. Although this was also customary of public reprimands, it made the whole situation even worse in my mind. It was incredibly humiliating for those girls. Analia and Jessica were both now shaking as they slowly reached to the bottoms of their shirts and grasped them before pulling them over their heads. They continued to cry but didn't dare object. Attempting to defy their Alpha now would only make matters worse. Once the 2 girls were down to only their bras and underwear, they froze on their hands and knees, staring down at the ground. Luckily, tradition didn't call for the victims to get completely nude. With no further words or hesitation, Dean pulled back the whip and then lurched forward, striking Jessica on her back. Jessica instantly shot up in pain, squealing and clenching her eyes shut as more tears poured out. As soon as Dean pulled the whip back, a deep, red mark was visible on Jessica's back. I gasped but tried to remain as composed as possible, despite my heart rate increasing by the second. Dean then turned and did the same to Analia, and she responded with a similar reaction. She cried out as the impact from the whip burned through her skin. I bit down on my lips so hard that it drew blood. 1. He turned back to Jessica and repeated his motions, causing an X formation to appear across her back as the new mark met the old. I slowly took a step back. Then he turned to Analia and did the same. Her small body collapsed flat on the ground and started to spasm from the pain shooting through her core. 2. My hands were now trembling at such a rate that it had to be noticeable. Although I was sure the crowd wasn't focused on me, with 2 young girls being punished in front of them. Before I could react any further, it happened again. 3. Dean lurched forward again, striking the mark into Jessica's back. This time, she collapsed as well. In the blink of an eye, Dean turned and repeated the movement on Analia. 4. Now, my legs were trembling. Was my mate really not feeling anything from these girls' pain? No sympathy? No regret? Both girls were limp, lying on the floor of the stage with no movement other than their labored breaths. I squeezed my eyes shut, not able to take in any more of the scene before me. The pain, the marks, and especially my mate, executing the reprimand. By now, he lashed out again at both of the girls once more. 5. A tear slipped from my eye, and I collapsed. Chapter 14. When I was able to open my eyes again, I noticed my surroundings were quite bright. I didn't understand why, as it had been an average, cloudy day in Dark Route, and the reprimand had taken place outdoors. After several minutes of forcing my eyes to open and adjust to the lighting, I realized it was bright not only because of the overhead ceiling light, but also the stark white walls that surrounded me. I had no idea where I was, causing panic to slowly take over. Glancing down at my arm, I realized there was an 4 placed, which also confused me, but helped me realize I was in the infirmary wing. "You're awake," a deep voice came from my left, startling me all over again. I turned to face the source and saw Dean standing on a small couch and approaching me. He was still dressed in his crisp, business clothes and appeared completely normal, other than a slight flicker of worry in his eyes. When my eyes met his blue and hazel ones, I was suddenly hit with my recent memories of what had happened. Those poor girls. I must have fainted. It was all too much. Dean slowly closed the distance between us and sat on the edge of my hospital bed. He stared at me for a moment with an unreadable expression before reaching out in what I assumed was an attempt to stroke my cheek or tuck my hair behind my ear. However, his action wasn't completed. As soon as I saw his hand coming for me, my mind flickered back to images of Dean reprimanding Jessica, followed by memories of my father. I quickly jerked away from him and scooted to the other side of the bed, staring at him with wide eyes. Dean's eyes instantly darkened. "I thought we were past this," he growled lowly. I flinched at his tone. I certainly thought we were past all of this, too, but seeing him being so harsh over petty crimes affected me in ways I couldn't explain. It brought back haunting memories of my life with my father, it scared me, and it made me fear the future. "Speak, Audrey," Dean commanded. I could tell he was trying to control his tone this time, as my reaction to his growl had been unfavorable. I started to open my mouth, but I couldn't find the right words. I couldn't think of the best way to tell him what I truly wanted to say. Everything seemed so confusing now. Could we ever be just regular mates? Before I could speak, tears began to stream out of my eyes and down my cheeks. I felt utterly stupid, sitting there with my mouth wide open and tears soaking my hair and hospital gown. Dean then reached out and wrapped his arms around me, pulling me against his chest before I had the chance to object. His touch brought comforting warmth and sparks from our mate bond, which calmed me, but also made me cry harder. "I don't understand. Please make me understand. I want to understand," he said into my hair as he pressed his lips to the top of my head and continued to hold me tightly. His voice was serious and gruff as usual, but cracked a bit, indicating to me that my crying was upsetting him. "How could you do that?" I finally shrieked, all of my emotions slipping out at once as the sobs continued to rack my body. I felt Dean's body tense. "Is this about the reprimand?" His question baffled me. Was he seriously that blind? "Of course, it's about the reprimand. How do you not see anything wrong with it? Especially in my eyes. You know the kind of life I had before I met you," I yelled as my body shook and tears continued to pour. Once my mouth shut, I froze. Had that outburst truly come from me? I don't think I've ever been so aggressive in my entire life. Dean had asked to understand, and that was the only way I could make him. My mind was a jumbled mess. My emotions were all over the place. My wolf was in my head, begging me to calm down, but I couldn't. "I would never do that to you," Dean growled, losing his composure again as he released my body and backed away. "How am I supposed to know that? What makes me so different from those girls?" I challenged. "You're my mate." Dean's tone was sharp, causing me to freeze this time. We stared at each other, his chest heaving as he forced his wolf back. One more outburst, and he could shift in the middle of the hospital room. I swallowed hard, waiting for further yelling, expecting the worst. My heart was drumming in my ears. I'd made a bold move, so I'd pay a bold price. "I'm your mate, Audrey," Dean said again, this time his voice slightly calmer. "I will never be one to cause you pain, and I will do everything in my power to make sure no one else does either." I hesitated, wondering if I should even speak the words that came to mind in response. After a few moments of contemplation, I decided to continue speaking my mind. I'd been bold thus far, so why not continue? "You've already caused me pain." Dean's expression quickly became unreadable as conflicting emotions hit him one by one. Anger, sadness, confusion, rage, hurt. disbelief, frustration, pain. His eyes darkened even further, and his body began to tremble as every muscle tensed. It was too much. His wolf was demanding to break free. To do what exactly, I wasn't sure, but I really didn't want to find out. Dean was already old-fashioned and rough around the edges as a human, so I knew his wolf's expectations and emotions would be even more serious and primal. Although I was shaken, I did the only thing I could think of that would calm him at this point. I reached out and grabbed his hand, and then pulled him as hard as I could so that I was able to rest his palm on my cheek and have my body only centimeters from his. Slowly, I looked up to gauge his reaction. This time, he looked astonished, which was understandable since I was putting out some mixed signals. He stared down at me with his mesmerizing eyes, and little by little, they softened. Silence surrounded us. It was clear that neither of us knew what to say at this point. I wanted Dean more than anything in the world, but I was terrified of all the unknowns in our still budding relationship. I knew he could feel my whirlwind of emotions through our mate bond, and they were likely overwhelming him when combined with his own. For once, I was thankful I hadn't marked Dean yet. I wasn't sure I could handle someone else's feelings on top of my own. Somehow, without even realizing it, I'd ended up with my face buried into Dean's solid abdomen, inhaling his natural, manly scent. His muscles felt more relaxed now, and his arms had found their way around me, holding me close. It was a bit crazy knowing only a moment before I'd been explaining how Dean's actions hurt and scared me, but now I wanted nothing more than to be in the comfort of his large, firm arms. "I'll try." His voice was barely audible, but I heard it. Too faint, simple words warmed my entire body. I can't promise to ever change who I am or what I value, but I can promise to try and take your feelings into more serious consideration before I act, and I can promise to try my hardest to make you happy, he added, this time louder. I felt my eyes begin to water again, but this time from happiness. Although I was still skeptical and unsure of the future Dean and I would have together, his reassurance made my heart soar. His words confirmed that he genuinely cared about me and wanted me to be happy with him as my partner. My father had only a couple of incidents of regret and remorse involving his abuse of me. Once was immediately after my mother's death, the first time he'd laid a hand on me. For days after, he was apologetic, and I was hopeful that everything would be okay. The other time had lasted only a day and was very faint in my memory. He'd always go right back to being hateful eventually. It was probably unfair that I continuously compared Dean to my father in my mind. After all, Dean had never physically hurt me. He took care of me, provided for me, and kept me safe, all things my father failed to care about after my mother was gone. I knew deep down that Dean was nothing like my father, but his temper and ultra-conservative beliefs were a bit off-putting at times. "Okay, thank you," I finally murmured in reply, my docile nature quickly returning. I felt guilty about my outburst and was thankful Dean didn't seem too bothered by it. Regardless, it wasn't who I was. I didn't enjoy yelling or being assertive. Quiet and reserved were the safer options and, in my opinion, much more comfortable. The next day, I was released from the infirmary wing sometime in the early afternoon. Dean had surprisingly taken the day off from his alpha duties to ensure I was okay and able to settle back into our quarters properly. I hadn't suffered any injuries from my syncopal episode, but I felt a bit drained, both emotionally and physically. Dean slowly led me back to our quarters, convinced that I should spend the rest of the day there resting. I would much rather be doing something to keep my mind occupied, but I'd learned quickly that it was pointless to argue with Dean, especially when it came to his concern for my well-being. His hand was resting on the small of my back, gently leading me out of the infirmary wing and towards the massive staircase of our pack house. Just as we were about to make our ascent, Dean paused. "I almost forgot. Hannah was wanting to tell you goodbye before they departed tonight," Dean told me. "Oh," I said in shock, bringing my hand up to my face in disbelief. There'd been so much going on that I'd completely forgotten that Luna Hannah and Alpha Rhett were still visiting our pack. Now new questions entered my mind. Had they attended the reprimand? Something told me neither of them would approve, and that it was perhaps the true cause of their departure. Yes, I'd love to tell Hannah goodbye before they leave, I told Dean with a small smile. Dean nodded and changed our direction, leading us away from the staircase and towards the guest wing of the pack house. It was one of the smallest wings, as Darkroot didn't accept guests often and certainly not in mass amounts, but it was well taken care of. When I worked with the Omegas, I personally checked and cleaned the guest wing weekly, even if the pack hadn't had any visitors. It consisted of 4 suite-style rooms featuring a small living room and kitchen area, 2 bedrooms, and a rather luxurious bathroom. After all, when Darkroot did accept visitors, they were often of high ranking, if not alphas and their families. Once we reached the guest wing, we walked to the end of the hall to the very last room where Hannah and Rhett were staying. From what I'd put together, Wyatt had requested a separate room. I didn't know the full story and history of Hannah, Wyatt, and Rhett, but from what I had heard, it was extremely complicated. Dean reached out and knocked on the door firmly, but not loud enough to be startling. Within seconds, the door was pulled open to reveal Rhett juggling several large bags, which I assumed belonged to Hannah. Dean, Audrey. So glad you two came by before we left. Hannah's been dying to check on you, Rhett told me with a smile, his gray-blue eyes sparkling a bit. For some reason, it was refreshing to know that not all alphas were as intense as Dean. I had no doubt that Blue Mountain loved and respected both Rhett and Hannah. Is it Audrey? I heard Hannah holler from further back in the guest room. It appeared we'd caught them in the middle of packing. Rhett chuckled and motioned for us to come in. Dean carefully nudged me inside, and Rhett shut the door behind us. Once we fully entered the living area, I caught a glimpse of Hannah waddling back and forth in one of the bedrooms, carrying piles of clothing between suitcases. I couldn't help but smile. It was quite humorous watching this heavily pregnant Luna rush to repack all of her belongings. I told her she didn't need to pack so much, Rhett told us, trying to keep his voice low. I heard that, Hannah yelled, poking her head out of the bedroom door. I've never visited any pack aside from Polar Moon, okay? I didn't know what the weather was like here. Hannah then let out a bit of a huff and threw down the articles of clothing she had in her hands before coming out into the living room. She smiled brightly as she approached me, but her eyes held a glimmer of concern. Before I could speak, she reached out and pulled me into a tight hug. It's been so great getting to know you, Audrey, she told me. I'm going to leave my number with you, so you can call me if you ever need to talk. Hopefully we can arrange a time to visit with each other again soon. I smiled back, of course. I really appreciate everything, Hannah. I felt some tears begin to form in the corner of my eyes. I knew Hannah had her own life and own pack, but she was really the only friend I'd ever made. It was nice having her here, knowing another female had my back. It seemed the only luck I had in making female friends here in Darkroot was with the elderly. Hannah squeezed me a bit tighter, bringing her mouth closer to my ear. It'll all work out eventually. I promise. Chapter 15. The following day, things were quiet around Darkroot. The reprimands were over, and Hannah and Rhett had returned to Blue Mountain. Pack life went on as usual. I don't know why part of me expected things to be different. I should have known better. The reprimands were simply another event that would be talked about for several days before they were put to the back of everyone's mind. It would likely haunt my dreams for weeks, though. Our morning was also fairly typical. I got up to cook breakfast and put myself together, while Dean was already up and in his office, tending to whatever duties he had for the day. Everything seemed so normal and casual, but at the back of my mind, a disturbing feeling lingered. Desperate to redirect my attention, I decided to make a grocery list to leave out for Helen. She checked at the end of every week to see what groceries we were out of and saw to it that our kitchen was promptly restocked. I felt much more helpful leaving her a list, rather than expecting her to keep up with the kitchen inventory on her own. After finishing that task, I was once again at a loss for what to do with my day. Hannah was gone now, and I couldn't start my Luna duties until Dean and I had mated and fully completed our bond. I certainly wasn't feeling brave enough to venture out and attempt to mingle with pack members again, not after everything that had happened last time. Noticing my drawing pad sitting on the living room coffee table, I decided to work on my drawings again. Perhaps it'd ease my mind. I settled onto the plush couch and pulled the drawing pad into my lap before grabbing a pencil. The lines and strokes involved in sketching were rather soothing and made me feel that I could potentially be good at something. I was sure I'd never be an excellent artist, but I could practice anyway. I zoned in on my drawing rather quickly. It was the flower that I'd started when Dean first got me the art materials, but I hadn't had the chance to finish it with all that had been going on. All I'd accomplished previously was the stem, as I'd never decided what flowers to draw. I still wasn't sure, honestly. It was hard to come up with unique images in your mind when you grew up as sheltered as I did. Perhaps a rose would do. I'd seen photos of roses and seen them embroidered on various materials, but I'd never seen one in person. Roses were a symbol of love, both romantic and familial. They were more commonly exchanged between mates, especially in the beginning of the relationship, but parents often bought their children roses on special occasions as well. I'd never been lucky enough to receive one, but I felt I could form their image in my mind well enough to make a nice sketch. The perfect image of a rose that I wanted to achieve on paper was completely consuming my mind. I was incredibly focused and determined to make this drawing as beautiful and accurate as I possibly could. I was so focused, in fact, that I completely lost track of time. When you concentrate so hard on such tiny details, it's easy to forget about the world around you. The sound of the front door opening finally broke my concentration. My head snapped up, and I looked over at the front door, wondering who could possibly be entering at this time. I glanced over at the clock and confirmed with myself that it was only about 1 in the afternoon. Helen didn't make her rounds until several hours later, and Dean didn't make it home until early evening. But much to my surprise, when the door opened, it was Dean who walked through. I quickly shut my drawing pad and sat up straight, raising my eyebrow a bit as he entered the room. His right hand was behind his back, and he seemed careful not to let his backside face me as he shut the door behind him. What was my mate hiding? Dean, I spoke, unable to hide the bit of shock in my voice. I wanted to surprise you. We haven't gotten to spend a lot of time together, getting to know each other, Dean explained, with a slight shrug. He slowly approached the couch, keeping his arm tucked behind his back the entire time. I couldn't begin to imagine what he was doing or what he was hiding. Once he was standing directly in front of me, he allowed his hand to come out of hiding and slowly brought it to his front, revealing a huge bouquet of deep red roses. My jaw dropped. Roses. For me? Surely not. It wasn't possible. Dean said he would be trying harder to make our relationship better, but I hadn't expected anything like this. I was speechless, and 1,000 questions were circling in my mind. Was it only a coincidence that I'd just been drawing a rose minutes earlier? Our bond, he reminded me, his words short and simple, but sufficient enough to remind me of what his mark on me provided him. He could catch glimpses of my thoughts and emotions, and as I thought about roses and focused on my drawing, he was likely bombarded with images of beautiful red roses along with my admiration for them. They're for you, Audrey. Take them, Dean told me, gesturing with his head for me to take the beautiful roses he'd gotten just for me. My mouth was still open in shock, making me look rather stupid, I was sure, but I slowly outstretched my arm to take the bouquet of roses from his hand. Thank you, Dean, I told him, my voice filled with sincerity. Dean nodded as he slowly lowered himself onto the couch next to me, never breaking eye contact. I inhaled slightly, admiring the smell of the roses mixed with Dean's woody scent permeating the air around me. Before anything else could be said, I jumped up from the couch and began to rummage through the kitchen cabinets, hoping to find a nice vase to place my precious roses in. They were gorgeous, absolutely perfect, and I wanted them to thrive for as long as possible. I exclaimed with a smile as I finally found what I was looking for in one of the bottom cabinets. It was a simple, glass vase, just the perfect size for my bouquet. I quickly filled it with water before trimming the rose stems and placing them inside their new home. Holding the vase carefully, I then walked across the kitchen towards the dining table and set them in the middle of the table before stepping back to admire their beauty once more. The red petals really brought color and warmth to the room. A thought soon came to me, causing me to freeze and turn back to face Dean. Do you mind if I put those there? I think it looks nice, but if you'd rather I put them elsewhere, you can put them wherever you'd like, Audrey. This is your home too, Dean replied without hesitation. My heart warmed, along with my cheeks, as I nodded to him and walked back over to the couch. I knew blushing over such simple comments was probably a bit ridiculous, but I couldn't help it. When you had a mate who was so hard and serious like Dean, you learn to appreciate the little things. I sat down next to Dean and turned my attention to him once more, a light blush still painted on my cheeks. So, you said you wanted to get to know each other better? Dean was completely focused on me, and although it was nice to have my mate's undivided attention, it also made me a bit nervous. I felt like he was studying every one of my features in depth, as if he felt the need to memorize them. Yes, Dean cleared his throat before continuing. I thought we could talk, and I could show you some of my favorite places in the pack, ones you may have never seen before. I smiled softly at him, truly appreciating the gesture. I'd love to learn everything I could about Dean. I wasn't very interested. There wasn't much to know, but my mate seemed like he had a lot he kept hidden deep down. I'd love that, I told him truthfully. Dean nodded. This evening I've also planned a formal pack dinner so that you can be properly introduced and get to know some pack members who are respectable individuals. I nodded, not missing his very specific word choice. Dean indicated to me that I would be meeting people who were not only important in some way, but also good people who wouldn't harass me. I felt nervous about it, as I hadn't really been introduced to the pack other than during the Luna ceremony, and I certainly hadn't had the chance to attend a pack meal as Luna yet. Before I could respond, Dean stood from the couch and held out his hand, indicating he wanted me to take it. I quickly obliged and stood from the couch as well, eager to see what places he wanted to show me that I hadn't found during my days of cleaning with the Omegas. Where are we going first? I asked him as he led me towards the front door and out of our personal quarters. Dean paused momentarily, and I noticed his jaw tense ever so slightly, somewhere that's very special to me. I raised my eyebrows slightly, but didn't question him any further. Clearly, if Dean deemed a place to be special, then it was truly important to him. I couldn't imagine where it could be in the pack house, as I felt I'd seen most locations during my cleaning schedules, but if Dean insisted that it was a secret, special place that no one knew about, I believed him. He led me downstairs, but not all the way down to the main level where most pack house facilities were located, such as the dining hall and library. Instead, we only went down one floor, where most of the pack members' personal apartments resided, including the one I'd grown up in. I was confused. Why would such a special place be immersed in the personal quarters of our pack members? Wasn't that less safe? Less secretive? Then it occurred to me that no one would think to look for something special on a floor where there was known to be nothing but personal residences. In fact, it was genius. Dean turned to the left and led me down the hallway that was opposite the one that I grew up in. I'd never explored any of the other hallways because, once again, they were just known to house my fellow pack members. There was nothing special about that, and considering I had no friends growing up, there was no reason for me to venture out. We quietly trekked down the hallway until Dean stopped us in front of a door with the number 250 on it. All of the apartments were numbered, and this one fell in numerical order with the rest. There was nothing special or unusual about it. It fit in perfectly. He let go of my hand for a moment and began to dig around in his pocket, finally pulling out a gold key that looked similar to the one that we'd had in my family apartment. He put the key into the lock and turned it with ease, pausing only for a moment to make sure no one else was around, and then led me inside. It was dark at first. There must have been thick curtains covering the windows, refusing to allow any light into the room. I found that a bit odd, but all of my questions were quickly answered once Dean flipped the light switch and the room lit up. The apartment was laid out just like all of the others in the pack members' quarters, but there was no furniture other than a small, intricately designed sofa in the corner. In fact, there was nothing at all in the apartment other than dozens of absolutely stunning paintings. I gasped, admiring the beauty of the painting closest to me. It was of our pack house, and although I always felt our surroundings were a bit dark and gloomy, this painting depicted the area beautifully. I was puzzled. Who painted all of these? Why were they kept in such an inconspicuous location? I turned to Dean, prepared to ask, but he began to speak instead. My mother painted these. Every single one, he said simply, a hint of remorse lingering in his voice. A small gasp escaped me yet again. The former Luna painted these? Not much was known about her, especially by my generation. I knew she was no longer living, but we'd never been told an explanation for her death, or really anything about her at all. The older generations knew, but they never spoke of her. They're absolutely beautiful, I told him truthfully, my voice staying soft. This was truly an intimate moment for us. Dean hadn't spoken of his mother before, and I couldn't help but think there was a reason for him bringing me here. I think so too, he admitted with a nod before walking across the room to admire a portrait. I followed behind, curious to see what the painting depicted that had drawn him so much. It was a portrait of two young boys. One had wide, brown eyes with an olive complexion and was painted mid-laugh. He was the youngest of the two, a toddler. The second boy was several years older, possibly 6 years old, and he looked very similar to the younger boy, except he had two different colored eyes, one hazel, one blue. I stared knowingly at the portrait in front of me. My former Luna had painted a picture of her two sons, Dean and Stefan. I could almost feel her love for them radiating through the painting. She painted them in such happiness, such light. Stefan was Dean's younger brother. The pack knew of him, but much like his mother, he wasn't openly discussed. He'd fled Darkroot a year or two after meeting his mate, and it was rumored that he'd taken up life as a rogue. My mother enjoyed art, just like you do. You remind me of her in more ways than that, and sometimes it's difficult for me, Dean told me, showing yet another piece of his heart. Although Dean's father raised him for the majority of his life, and was likely the reason for his cold nature in that moment, I could see Dean's love and admiration for his mother. I'm sure she was a lovely person and a wonderful Luna. I would have loved to meet her, I told him with a small smile. She would have loved you, he said simply and quietly, failing to elaborate. His eyes twinkled ever so slightly in the dim light, revealing a variety of emotions. I brought you here because this is a very private place for me. No one knows about it other than my father and brother. I wanted us to get to know each other better. I thought it'd help our relationship, and for me, there's no better place to start than with the woman who raised me for 13 years, he explained. His voice remained calm and steady as always, but I could tell he was trying to conceal some emotions. My heart was filled with warmth at his words and ached at the same time. I knew how it felt to lose a mother at a young age, but I hadn't known until now that Dean had been so young as well. Perhaps we had more in common than we thought. How did she pass? I asked cautiously. She was murdered, Dean replied without hesitation, his jaw tightly clenched.